Hello, I'm Daisy. 2 weeks ago, my father stood up in front of 30 people, friends, cousins, neighbors, and called my business a pajama hobby. He smirked. My mother laughed. Everyone else did too. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just stood up and walked out. Now here's the question I keep asking myself. What do you do when your own family doesn't want to understand you? They just want to stage you. And why did my father show up at my door 2 weeks later, holding cookies like nothing happened? What exactly was he trying to fix or control? And how did it all unravel from there? I hadn't been back to Boulder in almost a year. Spring had just started to stretch its legs, painting the trees outside my childhood home with the faintest hints of green. I stood in front of the house for a minute longer than I should have, watching the windows flicker with movement, listening to the echoes of laughter that filtered through the thick walls. It was Marla's birthday, my mother, and for the first time in months, she wanted the whole family together. Her words, not mine. I knew exactly what together meant in our family: performative warmth, plastic smiles, and enough unspoken tension to fill the Rocky Mountains behind us. I adjusted the foil over the homemade lemon tart I'd brought. Stupid, really, to think anyone would notice the zest I'd grated by hand or the effort I'd put into the crust. But I needed something in my hands, something to feel useful. Inside, the air was thick with cooking oil, cologne, and history. Dorian had arrived early, as always, already halfway through a beer, gesturing wildly while retelling some office anecdote. Callista was draped across the love seat like she owned it, her curated smile never wavering as she greeted people like a first lady at a fundraiser. Grant, my father, held court in the center, already halfway to tipsy, laughing too loud at his own punchlines. Marla saw me and offered a hug that was more pose than embrace. "Daisy," she said, "you look good. Thin. Are you eating?" I forced a smile. "Nice to see you too, Mom." The tart was placed among a row of store-bought cakes and desserts from the local upscale market. No one commented. No one asked about the recipe. We moved to the dining room. It looked the same as always. Heavy chairs, polished oak, too many forks. I took my usual place near the end, across from an uncle who barely remembered my name and next to a cousin I hadn't seen since college. Callista and Dorian sat in their usual power spots, close to Grant, within earshot of praise and attention. Dinner began with overlapping conversations, gossip about other families, job promotions, someone's trip to Italy. I stayed quiet. It wasn't that I had nothing to say. I just knew the moment I did, it'd be twisted into a joke, or worse, silence. Then Grant stood. "Now," he said, tapping his glass. "Before we get to dessert and Daisy's delightful little contribution," he smirked, glancing toward my tart, "I want to acknowledge my favorite daughter." He turned toward Callista and made a dramatic bow. Everyone laughed. "She just got promoted. Again. Vice President of Strategy. Fancy title, huh?" Callista waved her hand like it embarrassed her, but I could see the pleasure beneath. "And Dorian," Grant continued, "closed the biggest deal of his career last month. My boy's making 6 figures and still has time to mow the lawn for his mother." More laughter. Then he looked at me. That slow smile crept across his face, the one that signaled danger, not affection. "And Daisy," he said, voice dipping into mock sincerity. "Well, she's got her little project, don't you?" He turned to the guests. "She works from home, mostly in pajamas, I hear, saving the world one email at a time. Must be nice, huh?" Laughter. Actual belly laughs from people I'd once babysat or helped through math homework. I didn't laugh. I didn't even smile. My face stayed neutral, my hands still. But inside, something shattered. Marla chuckled behind her napkin. "Oh, Grant. She's always been our sensitive one." I excused myself a few minutes later, quietly collecting my coat, grabbing my purse, and walking out the front door. No one followed. No one stopped me. The drive back to my rental was silent. The kind of silence that isn't lonely, but loud with thought. That night, Marla texted, Don't be too sensitive, honey. You know your father. He didn't mean it. Love you. I stared at the screen, the words blurring under the weight of everything she didn't say. I didn't reply, because I knew exactly what she meant. I always had to be the one who understood, who forgave, who let it slide. I was the duct tape daughter, the one who patched things up, absorbed the jokes, smoothed the wrinkles. Not anymore. Sitting on the edge of my bed, still in the same clothes, I thought about every moment like this, every backhanded compliment, every time my ideas were brushed aside at family dinners, every time Grant had turned me into a punchline to boost his own ego, and every time Marla let it happen with a smile and a shrug. I wasn't confused, I wasn't sad, I was done. The decision didn't arrive in a flash, it came like a tide, quiet, steady, undeniable. No more showing up for these performances. No more hoping to be seen or understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. The next day, I deleted the family group chat from my phone. 2 days later, I unsubscribed from the family calendar invites. By the end of the week, I knew what I had to do. I didn't slam the door behind me, but that silence must have sounded louder than a scream. When I woke up the next morning, my phone buzzed with a dozen notifications. I didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, I stood by the kitchen window, fingers curled around a mug of coffee that had gone cold without a sip. The silence in my apartment was different than the kind that had blanketed the dinner table the night before. This one felt earned, intentional. Eventually, curiosity won. I unlocked my phone and instinctively opened the app I shouldn't have. The family photo was the first thing that appeared on my feed. Callista had posted it. They were all there, standing in front of Marla's ornate fireplace, smiling like they'd just solved world hunger. Dorian stood next to Marla, who wore her pearl necklace and that lavender sweater she reserved for guests. Grant was front and center, his arm around Callista, beaming like a politician mid-campaign. Even cousin Jared made it in. He hadn't been to a family event in 5 years. The caption read, "Grateful for family. Couldn't ask for more." I looked again. No one had tagged me, not one person. It wasn't an oversight. It was surgical. I stared at the photo longer than I meant to. There was a hollow spot on the edge of the group where I should have been, where I used to stand every year. Not once had I missed one of Marla's birthdays, not until now, and somehow my absence didn't just go unmentioned, it was erased. I tapped through a few more pictures, Dorian making a toast, Callista pretending to blow out candles with Marla, even a short video where Grant offered another one of his long-winded jokes. The comments below the post were glowing. "What a beautiful family. So full of love. You're lucky to have each other." I scrolled, numb, then paused. A name caught my eye. Linda Brewer. She used to be my 8th grade math teacher. She commented, "Where's Daisy these days? Haven't seen her in a while." Callista replied 3 minutes later, "She's doing her thing, off somewhere being creative, I guess. We're proud of her in our own way." In our own way. I didn't know if I wanted to scream or laugh, probably both, but I didn't react, not out loud, not even with a text. Instead, I closed the app and tossed my phone face down on the counter. I spent the afternoon folding laundry, then refolding it just to keep my hands busy. Every few minutes, my mind would drift back to that photo, that caption, that comment. I wasn't excluded by accident. I was excluded on purpose. Late that evening, I gave in and opened the app again. This time, the top post on my feed was a collage Callista had just uploaded. The title? Family Highlights, Achievements We're Celebrating This Year. There were 9 squares. Dorian's new office, complete with an assistant and a new desk. Callista's promotion, framed certificate and all. Jared's nonprofit fundraiser. A cousin's wedding. Even a photo of Grant holding his old high school football trophy for no reason other than nostalgia. Nowhere was there a mention of me. Not the business I'd built, not the clients I'd landed, not the studio I'd finally found a location for after 6 months of searching. I wasn't part of the story. Again, this time, it didn't sting the same way. It burned deeper. Not because I was surprised, because I wasn't, but because I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. They didn't forget me. They erased me. And there's a difference. When someone forgets you, it's absent-minded. Clumsy. It hurts, sure, but it's forgivable. But when someone edits you out of their narrative, on purpose, with intention, that's not forgetfulness. That's control. I didn't text Callista. I didn't call Marla to ask why. I didn't send a sarcastic comment or passive-aggressive emoji. I didn't do anything. Instead, I walked into my home office, turned on the lamp, and stared at the whiteboard where I'd outlined next quarter's strategy. It was full: client goals, deadlines, marketing plans. But none of it mattered in that moment. And for the first time in a long time, I sat down and whispered to the quiet, "What if I don't owe them proof anymore?" I let the thought settle. What if the hustle, the drive, the silent need to make something they'd finally respect? What if all of that wasn't about fulfillment, but validation? And what if I didn't need it? I leaned back in my chair, looked around my space. No gold plaques, no Photoshop smiles, no captions trying to convince the world I mattered. Just my work, my space, my choices. And for the first time, it felt like enough. The next morning, I deleted the photo app off my phone, not out of spite, out of clarity. I didn't want to scroll anymore. I didn't want to measure my worth in likes or cropped images where I'd been conveniently cropped out. I didn't want their approval. I just wanted peace. By noon, I'd gone through my contact list and archived half the names. Anyone who'd only reached out through birthday likes or obligatory group texts disappeared from view. I cleaned out my inbox, unsubscribed from Grant's monthly updates and Callista's curated newsletters. Not a word from them. No, "Are you okay?" No, "We missed you." Not even a "Hope you're doing well." The silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. But they weren't the only ones who could play that game. I spent the rest of the week pouring myself into my business. I signed 2 new clients, wrapped up a workshop on streamlining creative systems, and drafted a pitch deck for a local arts council. My work had never felt so grounded. And so mine. And still they didn't call, not because they were busy, because they were watching, waiting. They wanted me to blink first, to send the olive branch, to act like I'd overreacted again. Like always. But I didn't. I wouldn't. Because something had shifted, something fundamental. It wasn't their silence that haunted me. It was how loud my absence had become. The week had been unusually quiet. Too quiet, not in the peaceful, meditative kind of way, but the heavy sort of quiet that makes you brace for something to crash through the stillness. I kept waiting for the next message, the next backhanded comment disguised as concern, but nothing came until that Thursday. It was late afternoon, and I had just wrapped up a virtual consultation with a new client, a small boutique brand out of Portland that wanted help streamlining their internal systems. We'd had a great session. My notes were tight, the client was energized, and I felt like, for once, I'd walked into something that made me feel seen, capable, and in control. I was in the middle of pouring myself a cup of tea when the intercom buzzed. The sound jolted me. No one buzzed unannounced. My friends knew to text first. The clients I saw in person booked ahead. Even the delivery drivers knocked and left. I froze for a second, staring at the intercom box like it had betrayed me. Then I pressed the button. "Yeah?" "It's Dad." The voice crackled through the speaker like an echo from a dream I'd sworn I'd stopped having. "I'm downstairs. Thought I'd drop something off." I didn't answer right away. I wanted to pretend I hadn't heard it. Wanted to slip back into my apartment and pretend the tea kettle was the only thing demanding my attention, but old instincts die hard. I buzzed him in. He knocked softly, a 3 count, like we were playing a game we used to know the rules to. When I opened the door, he was standing there with a paper bag from the grocery store, King Soopers. The logo faded, the corners crumpled. Inside, I could already see the corner of a plastic cookie box peeking out. He lifted the bag like an offering. "You used to love these," he said. I didn't respond right away. Just stepped aside and let him in, wordlessly. He moved past me like he still owned the air in my space. I closed the door. He looked around. "Nice place," he muttered, eyes scanning the living room like he was doing an appraisal. "You've made it cozy." I walked past him, set the tea mug down on the counter, and opened the cupboard. Tea? I asked. Sure, he said, surprised. I knew it wasn't hospitality. It was a signal. I wasn't letting him control the narrative. Not here. He sat on the edge of my couch like he wasn't sure if he was staying long or hoping I'd ask him to. I brought over 2 mugs, mine still warm, his freshly poured. I didn't say anything. I just handed it to him, sat down in the armchair across from him, and waited. He cleared his throat. I didn't want things to feel tense, he began. I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. You know your mother worries, and Callista, well, she's got a lot on her plate. Another pause. I figured I'd come by. Bring a little peace offering. He gestured to the bag on the counter like the cookies were supposed to fix a decade of being undermined. I gave him a thin smile. They still use red dye in those? He blinked. What? The cookies. You know that dye gives me migraines now. Oh, he said. I didn't realize. Of course he didn't. He sipped the tea. Burned his tongue, probably, but didn't flinch. He looked around again. This time, his gaze settled on my desk in the corner, my whiteboard covered in project notes, the pinned-up client logos and vision maps. He nodded slowly, then tilted his head. So, he said, who helped you pull all this together? I blinked. What do you mean? He gestured loosely. I mean, it looks professional, sharp. You must have had someone help. A designer or, I don't know, business coach? It was said with that tone, the one that sounds supportive if you're not paying attention, but carries a blade if you are. I didn't answer right away. Just took a slow sip of my tea and set the mug down carefully on the coaster. Then I smiled, lightly, the kind of smile you use when you finally stop needing to explain. No one helped me, I said. Just me. He looked away. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not a scream, not a slammed door or a teary declaration. Just silence, deliberate, grounded, unbothered. He wasn't used to that. He'd expected defense, a list of names, a validation of his assumption that someone, anyone, must have carried me here. Instead, he got the truth, and it sat in the air between us like smoke. He stood after a few more minutes of awkward small talk, asked about my rent, my neighbors, and made a joke about parking in the city. I nodded, answered politely, but nothing in my posture said, "Please stay." At the door, he paused. You know, he said, you always did take things a little too personally. It's just how we joke. I tilted my head. Then maybe I've outgrown the joke. His eyes narrowed, just slightly. But he didn't respond. He stepped out. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment. My apartment was still. The kettle was still warm on the stove. His mug sat half full on the table. The cookie box remained untouched on the counter. He left the cookies on the counter, and the insult unacknowledged in the air. I didn't touch the cookies. They stayed on the counter for 3 full days, untouched, unopened, like a dare or a trap. Every time I passed them on the way to the kitchen or my desk, I felt the weight of them staring back at me, not because I wanted them, but because I knew exactly what they symbolized, a cheap gesture meant to say, "See, I showed up," without ever addressing the harm that came before. On the 3rd morning, a different package showed up. It was waiting outside my door when I came back from checking the mail. Soft pink wrapping paper, tied with a satin ribbon that was too perfect, too pristine, like it had never been touched by real hands. No return address, just a little white card slipped under the ribbon loop. Saw this and thought of you. Love, Mom. I didn't open it right away. I carried it inside like it might leak something I wasn't ready to feel. I placed it on the counter next to the cookies, where it sat like an intruder waiting to be acknowledged. But later that afternoon, when the light hit it just right and the house had gone still again, curiosity cracked the seal. Inside the box was a silky pink pajama set. Thin straps, soft sheen, delicate lace at the collar. And as soon as I pulled it out, I knew exactly what it was. The same color Marla had worn at the dinner. The exact shade of pink that she and Callista had quietly coordinated in, the feminine but polished uniform they always defaulted to when they wanted to send a message without saying a word. Back then, I hadn't thought much of it. Now, holding the pajamas in my hands, I saw it for what it was. This wasn't a gift. This was a signal, a smug, performative olive branch wrapped in silk. A whisper that said, "Here's how we see you." Or maybe more accurately, "Here's what you should be: soft, silent, delicate, ornamental." It hit me harder than the cookies, because the cookies were Grant's clumsy nostalgia. But this was Marla's precision, her way of pretending to care while simultaneously diminishing everything I'd built. I folded the pajamas once, then again. I placed them neatly back in the box, closed the lid, and pushed it away. That night, the phone rang. I let it buzz twice before I picked up, already knowing who it was. "Hey!" Dorian's voice came through, easy, practiced, like nothing was wrong. "You busy?" "I was just about to start something," I said flatly, not offering more. He didn't take the hint. "Listen, Mom's upset." I didn't respond. "I mean, she sent you something, right? She said she picked it out special." "She did," I said, "and it was very telling." He sighed like I was the difficult one, like I always had been. "Daisy, come on, it's not that deep. She's trying, okay? And you kind of escalated everything by walking out." I kept my voice even. "I didn't make the joke, Dorian. I just refused to laugh at it." "Yeah, but nothing," I interrupted. "You all laughed. Even she did. She was uncomfortable." "No, she was compliant. There's a difference." The line went quiet, then he softened his tone, like I was a child being unreasonable. "I just think, maybe if you reached out, said sorry." "For what?" "For walking out. For making it weird." I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictably absurd. "I didn't make it weird, Dorian. I stopped pretending it wasn't." He sighed again, longer this time. "Look, I know things aren't perfect, but you're being stubborn." "No," I said calmly. "I'm being clear." I hung up before he could say anything else. I sat there afterward, phone still in my hand, not angry, just drained. Tired of explaining why disrespect disguised as tradition still cut like glass. Tired of having to smooth it over so the others could stay comfortable in their curated dysfunction. That night, I placed the pajama box in a paper bag and tucked it into my closet. But it wasn't for safekeeping. The next morning, I added it to my donation pile. Not because I didn't appreciate the effort, because I saw through it, because I was done confusing pleasantries with peace. It was raining lightly when I dropped off the donation bag at the community shelter 2 blocks away. I didn't linger, didn't look back, just handed it over and walked back under a gray sky that felt more honest than any smile I'd been handed lately. Later that evening, I sat at my desk. The apartment was quiet again, but this time, it didn't press in, it gave space. I opened my laptop, stared at the glowing screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing in a folder name, Public Launch Prep. It was time, not for revenge, not to prove anything to them, but to draw a line between who I used to be and who I wasn't willing to become again. I opened my pitch deck, refined some slides, cleaned up the copy, rewrote my intro section so it sounded like me, not a diluted version. Then I scrolled to the final slide, the one with my name on it. Daisy Lang. Strategy. Brand direction. I looked at it for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because I finally recognized it. This time, when I closed the lid of my laptop, I wasn't shutting down. I was gearing up. I closed the lid of my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let the silence of my apartment press around me. Not heavy this time, but affirming. Like a room finally breathing again after years of holding its breath. I sat for a few minutes, staring at nothing in particular, just being still, until the phone rang. Not a message, not a notification, a full ring. It startled me a bit. I glanced at the screen. Yvette. Aunt Yvette. I hadn't heard from her in at least 6 months, maybe longer. She was my mother's older sister, always a bit of an outsider in the family tree, the one who'd moved to the Pacific Northwest decades ago and never really looked back. Some in the family said she'd gone weird. Others said she'd chosen a lonely life. But I remembered her differently. She was the first adult who ever taught me it was okay to say no. I picked up. "Hi," I said, unsure what else to offer. "Daisy." Her voice came through warm, full of something I hadn't heard in a while. Care without condition. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No," I said softly. "Not at all." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about you. Heard about the dinner." That sentence alone, without judgment or sugarcoating, felt like a warm cloth on a bruise. I didn't say anything. "I wasn't there, obviously," she continued. "But Marla sent me photos. You weren't in any of them. That told me enough." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I know what they did, Daisy. I've seen that kind of silence before. I lived it." That stopped me cold. "I'm sorry?" I asked. She laughed, not unkindly. "You think you're the first in our family to be erased? I left that house 30 years ago because I got tired of being told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. I told the truth once at a holiday dinner, and they never let me forget it. The room around me changed. The walls didn't shift, but something inside me did. Recognition, not sympathy, relief. She knew. "You're not wrong for needing distance," she said. "You're not broken because you don't fit their mold. Their mold is cracked. Has been for years." I swallowed the knot in my throat. It's like they don't even notice they're doing it. "Oh, honey, they notice. They just don't want to change. And when you stop playing your part, it makes them uncomfortable." I smiled, a bitter but grateful smile. "That sounds exactly right." We talked for almost an hour. About her garden. About a women's circle she'd started in her town. About the kinds of freedom that don't look glamorous but are everything. She never said, "You should go back." Never said, "Family is family." She just listened. Before we hung up, she said, "Your silence isn't weakness, it's your superpower." That line stayed with me long after the call ended. The next morning, I got up before the alarm. The light coming through my apartment windows felt less like a spotlight and more like an invitation. I brewed coffee, grabbed my notebook, and spread my pitch materials out across the kitchen island. It wasn't just a workday, it felt like declaration prep. I scheduled 2 new meetings, clients I'd been hesitant to reach out to, but not anymore. I designed a rough draft of a logo, nothing fancy, just my initials and a mark that felt solid. Grounded. Me. Then I ordered a sign for my new studio, white letters on a charcoal background. Clean. Clear. Daisy Lang. Strategy. Brand direction. No tagline. No daughter of or consultant for. Just me. Later that afternoon, Yvette sent a follow-up message. "Never forget, sweet girl. Quiet women can build empires. Just make sure your door doesn't swing both ways anymore. You don't owe re-entry to those who left you in the dark." I typed out 3 different responses, then finally just replied, "Thank you." Truly. By Thursday, I was back in the studio, still working through paint fumes and delivery delays, but it was coming together. Furniture arrived. The wall-mounted whiteboard went up. My new sign would be installed by the weekend. I was reviewing client files when the buzzer rang. I paused, confused. I hadn't scheduled anyone. I walked to the door monitor. It was Grant. Again. He stood there like he had the first time, arms crossed, expression unreadable, like he wasn't sure whether he was here to praise or punish. I could have ignored it, could have let him leave wondering. But something in me said, "No more ducking." I buzzed him in. When he arrived, I didn't offer tea. I didn't smile. I just opened the door, stepped aside, and let him in. He stepped into the studio slowly, eyes scanning everything. The clean walls, the large desk, the waiting area with 2 curated chairs and a small hospitality cart. It wasn't grand, but it was professional. He didn't comment. I didn't narrate. Instead, I led him through, like a gallery. No tour guide energy, no need to justify anything. He stopped at my office door, saw the framed draft of the new logo on the wall. He stared at it a beat too long. Then he muttered, "This isn't what I pictured for you." I didn't flinch. "That's the point," I said. Silence stretched. Thick and full. Not uncomfortable, but final. He looked at me like he wanted to say something else. Maybe a defense. Maybe a complaint. But he didn't. He turned and walked out. I didn't follow. Didn't wait. Didn't hope for a hug or a backward glance. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for him to look back as he walked away. By the time Grant left the studio without a word, the air in that space had changed. Not because he'd said something important, he hadn't, but because I hadn't needed him to. The silence had done all the speaking for me. I locked the door behind him, turned off the lights, and stood in the dark for a moment longer than necessary. The street lamps outside cast long shadows against the studio's freshly painted walls. The sign with my name was still leaning against the corner, waiting for installation. I touched it lightly on the edge, as if anchoring myself to the decision I'd made long before that visit. That weekend, the studio launch date was officially set. I chose it with a kind of precision that didn't require malice, just timing. Same weekend as Theo's engagement party. Different location, different audience, different purpose. I didn't make a public announcement. No Instagram teasers. No save the dates posted in stories. I wasn't after attention. This wasn't a performance. It was a statement. My guest list was hand-curated. Former clients, mentors, local entrepreneurs I'd collaborated with. Creative directors from brands that had once dismissed my emails and now returned to ask for help. There was no mention of family, not because I was punishing them, but because this chapter didn't require their approval. On Friday night, I arrived at the studio 2 hours before the first guest. I lit a candle in the corner, not for scent, but for presence. The soft flicker against the wall felt like a quiet drumbeat in my chest. The branding materials were already up, minimalist, strong. Every element in the room said, "You're not here to be impressed. You're here to belong." The glass wall at the front caught the reflection of my own name, etched cleanly in white, Daisy Lang. Strategy, brand direction. I took one long breath, then opened the doors. Guests trickled in slowly, exactly as I'd hoped. Not loud, not performative, just real conversations, laughter, curiosity. A woman I'd helped relaunch her jewelry line hugged me tightly. "You didn't just help me fix a brand," she said. "You helped me trust my voice again." Someone else complimented the mood boards on the back wall. "This feels intentional," she said. I smiled. "That's because it is." By the time the room filled up, I wasn't anxious. I was present. People didn't just ask about my work. They asked how I felt building it. They weren't interested in gossip or family drama. They were here because they'd seen what I created, and they respected it. And then came the moment I didn't expect. A former client, Malcolm, someone I'd consulted for during one of my earliest freelance gigs, raised a glass. He didn't make a big show. No clinking of forks. Just a calm, steady voice that quieted the room. "When I was on the verge of shutting my company down," he began, "Daisy didn't give me false hope. She gave me a map, a real one. She didn't just say what to do, she listened. And then she showed me what I was missing." He paused, met my eyes. "This studio isn't about success," he said. "It's about survival, turned into strategy." The room fell into silence for a heartbeat. Then came applause. Warm. True. No one clapping out of obligation. I didn't cry. I just nodded, placed a hand over my chest, and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Outside, night had fallen. The soft glow from inside reflected onto the sidewalk. People were still mingling, still talking, but the space felt full in the way I'd never experienced at family gatherings, without the masks, without the sharp elbows of competition. And then my phone buzzed. I checked it without urgency, just out of habit. A text from Callista. "Why didn't you tell us?" Simple, sharp, vaguely accusatory. As if the silence was the offense, not the years that led to it. An email came in right after, from Marla. Subject line: "This could have been a family moment." The body of the message was shorter than I expected. "You didn't even give us the chance to support you. That hurts more than you know. There was no mention of the years they hadn't asked, no reference to the dinner, or the joke, or the pink pajamas. Grant didn't write. I stared at the screen for a long minute. Then I locked the phone, slipped it into my pocket, and went back to the people who were still in the room. People who had shown up without needing to be asked. People who knew how to clap without needing a script. The silence I gave them wasn't cold. It wasn't bitter. It was intentional. A boundary. Not a barricade. A line that said, I'm not here to be saved. I've already arrived. Of course, that silence wouldn't last. Not with what came next. It started with a headline. 3 days after my studio launch, I woke to a ping from a local news app I barely remembered downloading. The push notification read, From side hustle to strategy, local consultant opens groundbreaking creative studio. It was me. The article included a photo from the launch, one I didn't pose for. I stood by the reception desk, speaking to a client. The angle wasn't flattering, but it was real. The piece quoted 2 attendees and mentioned the unique space I'd created for independent brands. It was light, respectful, celebratory, without fluff. Then, just a few scrolls down the page, another headline appeared. This one in the business section. Former city advisors past revisited amid daughter's rising profile. I paused. I tapped. And there he was, Grant Lang. A name I knew too well. A face I could sketch in sleep. But the article was not about him being a proud father. It detailed a business ethics investigation from 10 years ago. Nothing criminal, just shady. The kind of behavior people excuse when the person's charming enough or well-connected. Lapses in reporting, selective disclosure, and quiet favors exchanged for long-term contracts. Language that doesn't shout guilt, but also doesn't whisper innocence. The article didn't mention me, not directly, but the timing, 3 days after the studio launch, during a week where people were still talking about my opening, was no coincidence. Someone had leaked this. Maybe a former associate with a score to settle. Maybe someone who didn't like how neatly the family's image was being polished through proximity to me. And that's when it hit me. For the first time, his name was echoing in the community, not because of something he did, but because of who I was becoming. The irony was almost poetic. Later that afternoon, I received an email from a polished-looking leadership nonprofit, one I'd never interacted with before. Subject line, Celebrating Legacy, a spotlight on father-daughter entrepreneurial stories. I didn't even need to read the full message to feel the pit in my stomach forming. But I read it anyway. They wanted to feature me and Grant in a series highlighting family business dynamics. They referenced my recent success and the legacy of civic leadership I apparently came from. I closed the laptop, then reopened it, and replied with one line, No, I won't help rewrite a story I was never allowed to tell. I didn't hear back. But the silence had a different weight now. It didn't feel ominous. It felt like resistance had been noted. 2 hours later, Callista called. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I answered on the 3rd ring. What the hell did you do? She snapped, no greeting. Hi to you too, I said calmly. Do you know what's happening? The articles, the questions, people are calling Dad non-stop. I didn't leak anything, Callista. But you benefited from it. I paused, then said clearly, I didn't write the story. He did. I just stopped co-signing it. There was silence. Then she dropped the accusation. You sabotaged him. I didn't raise my voice. No. He built the house on sand. I'm just not holding up the frame anymore. She muttered something under her breath and hung up. 30 minutes later, a voicemail came through from Marla. Her voice was quieter than usual, less laced with polished steel, but still wrapped in guilt instead of accountability. You've really hurt him, she said. I don't know if you're proud of yourself, but I hope it was worth it. I didn't respond. I didn't even save the message. I just deleted it. Like a paperweight I no longer needed on my chest. That night, I stayed late at the studio. The lights were low. The hum of the street outside drifted through the windows. I watched as a mother walked past, holding her daughter's hand. The little girl had on bright yellow boots and a backpack too big for her frame. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw it, clear as anything. The girl tugged on her mom's sleeve, pointed up at the name etched on my window. My name. The mother leaned down and whispered something in the girl's ear. The child looked up at the studio again and nodded, her eyes wide. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was everything, because for the first time, I saw the ripple effect not in the family who tried to dim me, but in strangers who saw me without the filter of history. I had become visible without asking for permission, and slowly, the texts and emails from my family trickled to nothing. No more attempts to loop me in, no more invitations framed as obligations. Just space. It wasn't silence from anger this time. It was silence from understanding. They knew. I wasn't coming back. Not to their table. Not to their version of me. Not to the character they'd written and expected me to play forever. I stood by the window until the mother and daughter disappeared around the corner. And I smiled. Not because everything was healed, but because finally, no one else was holding the pen. But even after they stopped talking, they still wanted to be seen next to me. It came quietly, like most things from Marla did. No dramatic call, no voicemail laced with guilt or barbed affection. Just an email with a subject line that read, "A favor, if you're free." I hesitated before opening it. The message was brief, polite. Clipped in that practiced, polished way only my mother could manage, just enough emotional language to feel warm, but still stiff as a starched collar. Callista's daughter is getting married this spring, and we're arranging a professional portrait session to capture a complete family photo. Everyone will be there. It would mean a lot to have everyone included. Just smile and make it easier. There it was. Not an invitation, a prescription, and not for connection, but for optics. I read it twice, then leaned back in my chair at the studio. Sunlight poured through the window, lighting up the pale rug where we usually held client strategy circles. It was mid-morning, quiet enough that I could hear the gentle tick of the small wall clock above the reception shelf. The idea of that photo. All of us, lined up like the perfect family. Siblings arranged by age. Parents at the center. Me, placed at the edge, always the edge, told to tilt in, smile soft, say cheese. 1,000 pictures over the years, and yet somehow I was always the one blinking or blurred or left unnamed when they shared it online. And now they wanted me in the frame again, not for reconciliation, but for symmetry. I thought about the pink pajamas, the cookies, the soft launch that none of them attended, though they clearly followed it from the sidelines. I thought about how they'd never once asked what my business actually did, how Callista had said, "Don't come if you're going to make this about you." And yet, here they were, asking me to help complete the picture. I tapped out a reply and hovered for a moment, then typed a single line. Am I part of this family? Or just the frame? I hit send. The silence that followed wasn't unfamiliar. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like a decision hanging in the air, waiting to be made. The next message came not from Marla, but from Callista, short, sharp. If you're going to make this about you again, don't come. There was no pleas, no attempt at kindness, no pretense, just the confirmation I hadn't known I needed. So I didn't respond, and I didn't go, not to the photo shoot, not to the wedding planning brunch that followed, not to the group chat that lit up with color-coordinated outfit options and seating charts I was never mentioned in. Instead, I spent that Saturday morning at the studio, prepping for something else entirely, a youth mentorship event I'd been quietly building for months. A dozen local high school girls, most of them first-generation college-bound, were set to arrive just after 10. By 10:30, the room was buzzing. Laughter echoed off the walls. Hands scribbled notes, eyes lit up with new ideas. I led a session on strategic storytelling, how to pitch yourself not just as competent, but as essential. How to walk into rooms that weren't built for you and decide to stay anyway. During a break, one of the girls, maybe 16, hovered near the snack table. She held a bottle of water in one hand and her phone in the other. She glanced at me. "I told my mom I want to grow up to be like you," she said. The words caught me mid-step. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because I'd already done that kind of grieving. What came now wasn't sadness, it was something deeper. Recognition. Relief. I smiled. Then you'll probably grow up to be stronger. She grinned. She said the same thing. We went back to the group. Later that afternoon, after the last of them left and the studio had quieted again, I sat by the front window, sipping lukewarm tea. Outside, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I thought about the family photo being taken across town, the forced smiles, the careful posing, the inevitable cropping of reality, and I felt no ache, no longing, because this space, this work, this truth, was my portrait. Not posed, not curated, just mine. Not every story needs applause. Some just need to end in your own voice. It had been 3 weeks since the last message from anyone in my family. No blurry photos from Callista's wedding shoot, no out-of-context memes dropped into the once hyperactive family group chat. Not even one of those distant, just checking in texts from Marla that came with a timestamp of midnight and the emotional depth of an invoice. And for once, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like air. Clean, breathable, mine. That Thursday evening, I had just finished leading a mentorship session at the studio. The windows were fogged slightly from the warm breath of ideas and caffeine. The smell of paper, whiteboard markers, and orange blossom tea hung in the air, the scent of ambition in progress. A few of the mentees had lingered past the session, as they often did, chatting excitedly about a project idea that had accidentally turned into a pitch deck. Their laughter, unfiltered and earnest, had filled the space like music. They left behind half-drunk water bottles and the shimmering imprint of something real taking root. As I moved around the room, gathering notebooks, wiping off smudged dry erase ink, and refilling the tea tin by the window, my phone buzzed from its resting place on the bookshelf. One text. From an unfamiliar number. At first, I hesitated. Spam, probably. Another marketing campaign pretending to know me. But something, instinct maybe, urged me to tap it open. The message was short, unassuming. Auntie, I want to be like you. Mom says you're too serious. I think you're just real. I reread it. Then again, it was Callista's daughter, 16, maybe 17 now. The last time I saw her, she was draped in a tie-dye hoodie at a family barbecue 3 summers ago, the kind where everyone smiled too much and said too little. She had asked me once, tentatively, if I liked working alone. I'd answered with something that sounded wise at the time but didn't make full sense to me until recently. Some work is too important to dilute. Now, here she was, 3 years and several lifetimes later, finding me again. Her voice was still soft, but it had shape now. It carried edge, understanding, like she'd spent enough time watching people lie to recognize someone who didn't. I didn't reply. Not immediately. Instead, I walked over to the leather-bound journal I kept tucked into a drawer in the back corner of the studio. It hadn't seen fresh ink since the studio's opening day, when I'd scribbled something across the front page in shaky cursive, proof I was here. A phrase meant to remind me that even if no one clapped, I still mattered. I printed the text, trimmed the edges, taped it carefully to that page. Then I sat on the couch, the one with the fraying armrest I refused to replace, and let the studio dim around me. Outside, dusk folded gently into night. The wind moved through the trees like a soft conversation. It tapped lightly at the windows, as if checking in on me. I took a long, slow sip of my tea, and the quiet that followed wasn't hollow. It was full. Some things you hold on to, not because you expect more, but because they remind you that you're not invisible, that someone sees you, even when others refuse to. I glanced at the message one last time, then closed the journal with a deliberate quietness. She had seen me, and for now, that was enough. Days passed. The leaves outside the studio window began their seasonal slow dance from green to gold to rust. The trees looked like they were exhaling, giving in. I walked to work each morning in a light jacket and a pair of loafers worn just enough to mold to my stride. My coffee was always in hand, black, no sugar, as grounding as a mantra. Still, no word from Grant, no check-in from Marla. And something in me noticed that absence not with longing, but with clarity. I didn't miss them the way I once had. I didn't crave their validation. I didn't brace for their approval. I didn't write imaginary monologues in my head, prepping for conversations that would never come. I didn't flinch when I thought of their names. Some stories don't end in reunions, they end in realization. And with that realization, peace began to bloom. The door they once held closed, with conditions, critiques, and unspoken rules. I had stopped knocking on it. And once I stopped knocking, I saw it for what it was. A wall. So I built a new door. One where I could decide who walked through. One where I could choose myself. Again. And again. That afternoon, as I sat at my desk finalizing materials for the upcoming mentorship cycle, I created a new presentation slide. Session title, Building from Within. It was about foundations, about self-definition, about the bravery of ownership, especially when no one else hands it to you. It was about not needing to be seen to matter, about building rooms when no one opens the door, about being the architect of your own belonging. At the very end of the deck, I added a quiet slide. Just one sentence, black text on a white background. Legacy isn't what they say after you're gone. It's what you live out loud while you're still here. I leaned back in my chair. Let the words settle. Let the truth of them sit in my chest, not heavy, but firm. The studio was quiet around me. My name shimmered softly on the front glass window in brushed lettering. Daisy Lang. Not flashy, not oversized, but unmistakably mine. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling through the trees and fluttering the papers on my desk. I stood, crossed the room, and opened the window just a crack. A breeze slipped in. Steady, clear, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. It simply arrives and keeps moving. I closed my eyes for a moment, let it pass through. Then I smiled. Not the kind meant for photos, not the kind that waits for praise, but the kind that rises up from deep knowing. They had their dinner table, with all its performances, its scripts, and its unspoken rules. I have my name on the door. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not waiting for a seat. I'm walking in as the architect. And that's more than enough. Sometimes, walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. When you stop waiting for people to see your worth, you make space to finally see it yourself. Have you ever been the outsider in your own family? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that speak quietly, but deeply. Hi, my name's Alessia. My family calls me dramatic, emotional, even ungrateful. They told people I just didn't want to be involved when they erased me from my mother's 70th birthday, when they printed my name wrong on official invitations, when they quietly rewrote the trust that was originally mine. But what they didn't say? They used my company's jets, my systems, my contracts, while telling the world I was the failure. And when I found out what they'd done, I didn't scream. I rewrote everything. But now I wonder, what hurts more? Being left out of the story, or realizing they never meant to write you in at all? They excluded me from Mom's birthday, but I'd already started rewriting my guest list. That list started the day my name vanished from the family photo wall. It wasn't a dramatic event. No announcement. Just a quiet rearrangement of frames. One afternoon, I walked into the hallway in Charleston, where all the family milestones were hung, and there it was. My face. Gone. A photo that used to sit right between Teresa's law school graduation and Dorian's wedding had been swapped for a Carter Foundation award from a local gala. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Mom always said, let's not make a fuss over little things. And that's what I'd become. A little thing. Easier to remove than explain. Easier to replace than recognize. Back in Atlanta, I stood by the kitchen window, phone still in hand, rereading the message. Maybe sit this one out. Just 5 words that told me exactly where I stood in their pecking order. The air outside was thick with early summer heat, the kind that makes you sweat, even in the shade. I stared at the horizon as a jet ascended beyond the trees. Its tail disappeared behind the cloud line, but my memory didn't. They didn't know. They didn't have to know. The jet belonged to a fleet under my name. leased out through a corporate web so dense not even our family attorney could trace it. It was funny how often people assume ownership looks loud. Cars, parties, plaques on walls. But the loudest kind of power is the one that operates in silence. 6 months ago, I tried to speak up about Dorian's accounting errors, the transfers to a Cayman shell company, the fake consultants. I showed them everything: spreadsheets, timestamps, wire records. Their response: a family intervention. Not for him, for me. "You're causing unnecessary tension," Mom had said. "We've all moved past it." Teresa chimed in with her soft therapist voice. "Maybe this is your way of asking for attention." I remember every word. And the worst part? They said it in a loving tone. As if I were the unstable one. As if truth-telling was just another symptom of a daughter who couldn't let go of her need to be right. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I left. Not the room, the role. The role of the difficult one, the one they could gaslight, silence, mold. That was the night I drove back to Atlanta with the windows down and my future echoing in the silence. I poured all of it into work, the real kind, not the performative foundation nonsense they did for press photos. I restructured the company, consolidated the aviation software, pulled in new clients, bought out 2 regional charters, and folded them under my shell. They didn't notice. They were too busy planning Mom's 70th. And now, on the eve of the event, I was being told, once again, to make peace by disappearing. I won't lie, it stung. Not because I wanted a slice of cake or a seat at the table, but because after everything I did to keep the family from imploding, this was my reward. Deletion. I could have replied to the message. Something gracious, something like, "I understand." That's what Alessia, the obedient youngest child, would have done. Instead, I watched that jet, my jet, disappear behind the clouds and thought, "They're flying with wings I built. Let them. Just don't expect me to stay grounded while they do." But plans like that only work when you have no leverage. And I did. That night, I stayed in, poured a glass of that mid-shelf Pinot I usually reserve for guests, and sat by the window as Charleston faded behind the clouds of memory. It was gala night, family night, whatever they called it now, and I had officially been asked not to show. The irony: they were using a jet from my fleet, leased through a dummy holding account under a different name, of course. They'd never bothered to ask who owned what. They just assumed anything they used must belong to someone else with a last name that mattered. Mine only counted when it was convenient. My phone buzzed around 7:10 p.m. First came the photos, group shots, balloons, glasses raised in slow-motion boomerangs. Everyone looked like an ad for Southern Harmony. Teresa in that floor-length emerald gown. Dorian, of course, wore navy. The family's golden boy had always had a thing for looking respectable. And there she was, my mother, standing in the middle, wearing the pearl necklace I'd commissioned for her birthday. She didn't know I designed it. Carol, our longtime housekeeper, had helped deliver it discreetly. I'd made her promise not to say anything. At the time, it felt noble. Now, it just felt stupid. They captioned the photo, 3 generations of Carter strength. No mention of the 4th. Me. Then Teresa called. I stared at her name on the screen long enough for it to ring twice. I almost let it go to voicemail. But curiosity. It's a hell of a thing. "Hey!" she chirped, her voice sugary and just a touch too bright. "We're about to toast to Mom. Even Dorian wrote something sweet for once. Want me to put you on speaker?" I should have said no. I should have said anything. But instead, I let the line stay open. And then I heard it. "To the children who have never left my side," Mom began, her voice proud, polished, rehearsed. "To Teresa for being my rock. And to Dorian for showing us all the power of redemption." There was no third name, no pause, not even a breath where mine might have gone. The room burst into clapping. Silverware hit glassware. Someone shouted, "Well said!" Teresa chimed in, "And to family, who always stands together." I bit down on the inside of my cheek. Hard. Teresa laughed again, as if it were all so organic, so innocent, as if I hadn't spent the last year cleaning up Dorian's messes behind the scenes and running the very infrastructure that flew Mom to her spa weekends and got her charity guests home from her events. I found my voice, but only enough to whisper, "You forgot someone." I wasn't sure if I hung up or if she did. The line just stopped. I sat there for a while after that, the wine untouched, the house quiet. And I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself until now. It wasn't about being left out of a toast. It was about being edited out, intentionally. People don't have to scream to erase you. Sometimes they just smile and toast to everyone but you. And if they do it long enough, the world forgets you were ever part of the picture. They were rewriting history, while I was still alive to witness it. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. No, something else had started growing in that space. Not rage, not grief. Clarity. Control isn't about noise. It's about knowing when to flip the switch. It had taken me years to learn that. Growing up in a family where volume equaled dominance, I used to think the loudest person always won. But silence, when used intentionally, had its own weight. And lately, I'd stopped filling up every space with explanations no one was asking for. That night, I scrolled through the latest round of party photos. More compliments under Teresa's curated captions. I wasn't angry anymore. Just observant. Detached in the kind of way that comes when you realize your name isn't just forgotten, it's been quietly replaced. I clicked open the last photo she'd posted. It was a close-up of Mom, hands folded under her chin, smiling like the world made perfect sense. She wore the necklace I'd sent her, the one I had designed, the one I hand-picked each element of, from the single pearl I found in Sanibel to the gold clasp I had custom forged. Engraved on the back was a single line, LK, worth more than you know. I didn't attach a name. I didn't want recognition. That was never the point. But the caption under the photo read, "From her favorite daughter, timeless, just like her." Favorite daughter? The comments followed fast. "Teresa, you always have such impeccable taste." "She's lucky to have you." "Of course you picked it out. It's perfect." I stared at the screen until it blurred. Then I zoomed in on the necklace, just to confirm it was the same one. Of course it was. That was the part that hurt. I had given it freely, and they'd taken it fully. My phone sat heavy in my hand as I scrolled back to the original invoice. The delivery receipt. The card that I'd left blank, by design. I wanted the gift to speak louder than my name ever could. But Teresa had spoken for me. And no one questioned it. I sat back, chewing over the same truth I kept bumping into. It was never about facts in our family. It was about who said them loudest, prettiest, most convincingly. They didn't need to erase me in public. They just had to let others assume I was never there. I opened my contacts and tapped Carol's number. She answered after 2 rings. "Evening, Miss Alessia." "Carol," I said slowly, "did anyone ask about the necklace?" She hesitated, and I could almost hear her shifting the phone from one shoulder to the other. "Well, your mother assumed it came from Miss Teresa." I didn't correct her. "Did you know it would play out like that?" "I suspected," she admitted gently, "but you never told me to say otherwise. And Teresa, she just stepped into the space you left blank." There it was. Teresa didn't steal the gift. She claimed the silence. And I let her. Not because I was weak, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining my choices to people who already had their version of the truth laminated and framed. After we hung up, I walked to my desk and pulled the original sketch of the necklace from a drawer. My initials were on the back of that sheet. The clasp design bore my exact proportions. It wasn't proof for anyone else. It was proof for me. They can pretend she picked it. But I knew the origin. I knew the story. And deep down, so did Carol. Maybe even Mom. But it didn't matter anymore. Because if I had learned anything over the past few months, it was this. Sometimes you don't fight lies with louder truths. Sometimes you build so quietly that by the time they realize you were the architect, the entire house is already under your name. They stole credit. They rewrote history. But I was rewriting ownership, and they weren't invited to the edit room. And this time, I was done pretending to swim. I turned off the living room lamp, letting the low amber glow fade as the city lights outside flickered through the blinds. The silence inside my condo wasn't cold anymore. It was intentional. I stood by the window, arms folded, watching another of my jets take off from the private strip across the river. It was the same model I'd insisted on upgrading the fleet with, a sleeker engine, better fuel economy, and a cabin system so quiet the hum barely registered over conversation. I didn't need to guess who was on board. The tail number confirmed it. Same jet Mom had used last week for her so-called girls' retreat in St. Bart's. She'd bragged about how smooth the flight was in a text to Teresa. Teresa forwarded it to the family group chat, conveniently omitting that the carrier belonged to Elite, my company. They thought they were chartering from a boutique executive firm. In reality, they were boarding aircraft operated through 3 layers of shell companies that led right back to me. I never hid the contracts. I just didn't label them in neon ink. They never asked, and I never offered. Years ago, when I first told Dad I wanted to fly, he laughed. "That's a man's field, sweetheart. Aviation's about grit, pressure, split-second judgment. You really think that's where you want to be?" I didn't answer him then, but I knew. Teresa, on the other hand, found it charming. "Honestly, Allie, you'd ruin your skin flying around in all that dry cabin air." I think she thought she was being helpful, so I stopped telling them what I was doing. I stopped asking for space to dream. Instead, I learned how to build without applause. I started small, consulting for someone else's fleet. Then I branched out. I saw the gaps in service, the frustrations high-profile clients had with consistency and privacy. I fixed what no one else was paying attention to, and I never, not once, put my name on the top line. What they didn't know is that every time they took a trip, praised the service, or complained about a missed drink request, they were logging experiences inside a system I designed. Their names were coded as VIPs. The data sat on servers I owned. The crew that smiled at them in pressed uniforms had all signed NDAs issued through my legal team. And I stayed behind the curtain, collecting invoices and watching them float along, clueless. I opened my laptop and pulled up the latest flight plan. Carter Foundation Retreat, Nassau, Bahamas. Round trip. Departure, Friday, 8:15 a.m. Return, Monday, 4:10 p.m. Filed through a mid-tier travel agency using a front-end booking API my company had built 6 months ago. My cursor hovered over the Flag for Compliance review box. I clicked. The screen blinked. A notice went out to operations. I didn't feel a surge of power, not the way movies make you think you will. I felt quiet, balanced. It wasn't vengeance. It was accountability, handed out in the language they understood best. Policy, contract, procedure. Once upon a time, I'd believed fairness could be earned with patience, that if I just worked hard enough, quietly enough, they'd eventually notice. But life doesn't reward silence. It exploits it. I checked the jet's maintenance record, confirmed the onboard Wi-Fi pinged the same cockpit modem I had installed as part of our smart route rollout. Then I marked it. Hangar 14, Charleston Executive, flagged, not canceled, not delayed, just placed under review. No confrontations, no drama, no emails that started with, "I feel." This wasn't about emotional justice. This was about positioning. Teresa once told me at brunch, after one of our rare civil moments, "You can't burn bridges. You never know when you'll need to cross them again." She was right. But what she didn't realize is, sometimes you don't need to cross a bridge, because sometimes you own the whole river. But business only stays clean when someone's watching the books. I wasn't planning to start my Monday by seeing Dorian's face. But there he was, front and center on LinkedIn, all grins and polished teeth, shaking hands with a VC guy who looked like he'd never flown commercial in his life. Carter Financial signs partnership with Montrose Equity. The headline read, Legacy, Loyalty, Vision. I almost laughed out loud. Legacy? That man hadn't built a thing in his life. Loyalty? He was only loyal to the mirror and his own mess. Vision? If you count hiding 6 figures behind fake consulting firms as vision, then sure, he was practically clairvoyant. I stared at the photo longer than I should have. Not because I missed him, but because I remembered every sleepless night I spent fixing what he broke. When I reported the embezzlement, I thought I was saving the family from public humiliation. Instead, I became the family embarrassment. I was the troublemaker, the overreactor, the one who needed to let it go. They called it a mistake. Creative liquidity, Mom whispered, like it was a misunderstanding, not a white-collar crime. Dad didn't even look at the numbers. I remember him leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, saying, "You sure you're not just jealous of your brother's success?" That one stung. Not because it was true, but because it told me exactly what he believed. Dorian was a builder. I was a bother. And now, my bother of a brother had taken his tarnished resume and spun it into gold. I closed the post and pulled up the internal elite logs. I wasn't doing this to snoop. I had every legal right. Carter Financial had used Elite's services for 3 previous events. I remembered because I was the one who greenlit their account. Montrose Equity was now tied to them through this new partnership. Funny thing, Montrose had used Elite for their last 3 international retreats. They loved our low-noise interiors and hyper-secure passenger manifests. My fingers hovered over their access records. Then I checked the charter logs from Nassau last year. Montrose's CEO had praised our team's discretion so hard, he even tried to poach our lead pilot. Interesting. I opened a new window and drafted an internal compliance flag. Standard language. Pending verification of financial ethics and partner compliance under Clause 14B of our corporate trust standards. It wasn't personal. It was protocol. I had no interest in airing out Dorian's old crimes. But if his name was now tied to any of my vendors, he had to clear the same bar as everyone else. That's how systems work. Once you're inside mine, you follow the rules. Rules he thought I didn't know how to write. I remembered something Dad said once, during a heated dinner, when I told him I was drafting my own contracts. Alessia, people don't care who's right. They care who's holding the pen. Well, guess what, Dad? I was holding the damn pen now, and I was writing people out. I sent one email, just one, to the legal contact at Montrose. Subject line, Urgent, Partnership Ethics Verification. Body, please confirm Dorian Carter's compliance with your internal anti-fraud policies to continue partnership privileges under our inter-vendor clause. No threats, no emotion, just facts. It hit their inbox at 9:37 a.m. sharp. By 10:12, their scheduler had opened it twice. No reply yet. I didn't wait. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about alignment, making sure the people tied to my operations weren't living double lives. I'd spent enough time being quiet while other people decorated themselves with what I built. Now I was putting down boundaries. Quietly, legally, precisely. Because eventually, the truth doesn't just come out. Sometimes it knocks on the wrong door with the right signature. Instead, I started listing everything they didn't know I owned. I pulled up a document I hadn't looked at in weeks, an internal chart mapping out every corporate entity tied to Elite, directly and indirectly. There were names they'd recognize, Crescent Solutions, Pine Coast Logistics, but most were ghosts. Shells stacked like Russian dolls, signed under borrowed surnames, partners of partners. I had built a network so discreet it could function in plain sight without drawing attention. That was the point. Mom's voice still echoed in my ear. It's still your brother. What she meant was, protect the family, not the truth, never the truth. I sat with that for a long time. It was just past 11. The house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't turn on music. I didn't need anything competing with the volume of that sentence. He's still your brother. And what was I? The enemy? The whistleblower? The disappointment? At 16, I caught Dorian funneling donation money from a school supply drive into his own private debit account. He blamed the vendor, said they miscalculated the invoices. I brought the proof, side-by-side transfers. And what did Mom say? You don't destroy someone's future over one bad decision. That line stayed with me longer than any apology. I was made to sit through an awards banquet that week. He received a community service medal. I clapped. Quietly. Like a good team player. That was the game. Lie beautifully, get rewarded. Tell the truth, get erased. This wasn't new. It was just louder now. The phone call earlier had revealed more than Mom intended. I'm not saying he was right, she'd said. But she was. Because defending Dorian's image, no matter how much of it was borrowed, was more important than recognizing who kept the foundation from cracking. My foundation. I walked over to my printer and hit print on the ownership summary. 56 pages. I watched the first few sheets slide out. The names, the timelines, the signatures. Every move documented. No drama, just ink and record. By the time the printer finished, it was midnight. I carried the stack to the kitchen table and flipped through the first 10 pages. A legal structure born of necessity. A wall built to stop their noise from bleeding into what I had to build to survive. I poured myself a glass of water and stared at the ceiling. She didn't even ask if it was true. Not once during that call did she say, "Did you send it?" Or, "Was it accurate?" Because it didn't matter to her whether Dorian had broken the rules. It only mattered that I'd made someone notice. Family doesn't do that. Doesn't do what exactly? Doesn't hold each other accountable? Doesn't ask questions? Doesn't refuse to be used? I could have called her back. I could have softened the edges, reminded her of how I once used to bring her tea when she had migraines, or how I drove Dorian home drunk from a party so he wouldn't get arrested. But I didn't. Because if I had learned anything, it was this. Silence was their currency, and I was done letting them spend me. I opened my laptop and started drafting a memo, not to my family, but to my legal team. A simple note. Begin prepping internal ownership assertion, including trustee reassessment filings. No anger, no commentary, just a shift, the kind that doesn't make noise, until it does. Except this time, business included consequences. By Thursday afternoon, I was at the office, window open behind me, Charleston's skyline muted in the haze. The printer hummed in the corner, contract packets and legal addendums spilling out onto the tray one after another. I wasn't touching them yet. I already knew what was inside. Instead, I reached for a leather folder labeled Hanger Leases, Carter Family. I hadn't opened it in over a year, maybe longer. It was one of those files I kept tucked under tax agreements and special airspace permits. Important, but rarely needed. Until now. I flipped past the summary pages until I hit paragraph 17. Subclause 3. Right where I remembered it. Elite Holdings reserves the right to revoke hangar access and related services with 24-hour notice under operational discretion or security concerns. Standard language. The kind of clause no one reads unless they're hunting for an out or looking for a way in. And my family? They didn't read it. They just signed. They never asked who drafted the lease. They never wondered why it was so specific, why the notice window was so narrow, why I'd insisted on adding that particular line to an otherwise generic agreement, because they didn't know I was the one who wrote it. They thought they were dealing with a faceless legal team, some assistant or vendor. Maybe someone young and eager to impress. They never imagined the clause was mine, that I built it, word by word, like a trapdoor under their feet. Just in case. While they poured champagne over ribbon cuttings and boasted about family-owned legacies, I was embedding contingencies, quiet little escape hatches no one noticed until someone pulled them open. And now, I was ready to test one. I leaned back in my chair, rereading the clause slowly, then picked up the phone and buzzed Sarah, my head of legal. I need you to issue a formal notice for Hangar 19, I said. Use the 24-hour clause. Activation. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. There was a beat of silence on the other end. You're sure? She asked, cautious but composed. Very. Reason? I hesitated, then answered with the truth. Operational security. She didn't ask which operation. That's what I liked about Sarah. She knew when to follow the rulebook and when to trust the hand holding the pen. I ended the call and opened my inbox, scrolled to the archived contracts, and cross-checked the routing logs for the jet parked at Hangar 19. Sure enough, it was the Carter family's flagship plane, the one Mom insisted on calling the Legacy. The irony didn't escape me. They'd be flying out Saturday morning. Nassau. Carter Foundation Leadership Retreat, sponsored by a company that had quietly trimmed my name out of every footnote. Not anymore. I checked the calendar. There were still a few hours left in the day, and I didn't want to rush this. I wasn't operating out of emotion. This was structure, clean, silent, effective. They wouldn't receive an alert tonight. No warning, no blinking system. But tomorrow, when they showed up with luggage and press folders and legacy branding, they'd find the hangar dark, the plane locked, and no staff on site. Just a small paper notice posted at the gate. Access temporarily suspended under operational review. Please contact your leasing administrator. They would call the number on the sheet. It would route to a department that only spoke in protocol and escalation chains. No apologies, no explanations. Because this wasn't revenge. This was architecture. They taught me to build walls to keep my mouth shut. So I learned to build systems instead. Systems that could speak without me. I packed up the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and turned off the printer. It was nearly 6. The city outside had started to flicker to life again. Car lights threading through traffic, sirens in the distance, the pulse of people who didn't know their weekend plans were about to change. But I knew. I reached for my keys. Because while they'd be stuck grounded, staring at a locked gate, I'd be airborne. Off to the next deal, my next project, my next move. They wouldn't even know what hit them until the jet didn't move. And by then, I'd already be gone. Because if silence was my crime, I'd weaponize it properly. The sky was already pinking when I stepped out of the car. I had driven straight from the office to my place in Midtown, bypassing traffic by cutting through the back streets I knew too well. The weight of the week was tucked into my shoulders, but I wasn't tired. Just focused. My plan didn't need noise. It needed timing. And that part I'd perfected. I poured myself a glass of water, took off my shoes, and sat at the kitchen table where my laptop waited. Still open, glowing softly in the dim light. One more look at the schedule. 7:17 p.m. The jet's check-in window began at 7:10. I opened the family group chat. Not to speak, just to read. No one had mentioned me, of course. Mom had shared a photo of the flower arrangements for the retreat departure. White roses, navy ribbons, Carter Foundation tags printed in gold. Beneath it, Teresa replied, elegant, just like our legacy. That word again. Legacy. It wasn't the word that got to me. It was how easily they used it, like it had no cost, like it wasn't built on someone else's back. I stared at the screen a moment longer. Then, at 7:12 exactly, I opened a blank text and typed, I won't be at Mom's birthday, but you may want to double-check your flight plan for Monday. Send. No emojis, no follow-up, not even my name. Let them sit with it. 3 minutes passed, then 6. Then my screen lit up. Teresa. What are you talking about? Don't start this, Alessia. I didn't respond. Instead, I tapped into the back-end control panel for Elite Airfield Systems. Selected Hangar 19. Scroll. Tap. Override authorization? Yes. I toggled the switch. Nothing flashy. No alarms. Just a quiet shift in protocol that locked the doors, disabled fueling permissions, and froze the departure manifest in place. Then came the second call, not from them directly, but from their assistant, Caitlin. Her voice was tight but polite. "Hi, Alessia. Sorry to bother you, but there seems to be an issue with the boarding app. The jet isn't verifying credentials for tomorrow's flight. I think something's wrong with the reservation server." "Oh?" I said, sipping my water. "That's odd. Do you happen to know who we should talk to at Elite for a manual override?" "I'll look into it," I said, then hung up. I walked to the living room and sat down, curling my legs under me as the quiet took hold. This was the part they never taught. The stillness after the switch is flipped. Not vengeance, just the calm of control. I opened a second window and composed a brief message to Marcus, our operations lead at the Ground Control Center. Flight 719 Carter. Cancel takeoff clearance. Confirm full lockdown. Don't lift without executive override. I didn't need to say anything else. He knew the weight of my words. I sat back and waited. Because sometimes the most powerful thing isn't what you say, it's what you don't allow. 20 minutes later, I got the update. The pilot had attempted to log in. Credentials failed. The system responded with, "Access denied. Restricted flag triggered by internal security protocol." Their jet? Going nowhere. Their plans? Grounded. Their image of untouchable legacy? Fractured. One silent keystroke at a time. I looked at the clock. 7:41. They were probably just sitting down to dinner, wine glasses clinking, talking about their upcoming impact retreat. And I? I was at home, barefoot, in sweatpants, making power plays without ever raising my voice. They used to call me the troublemaker, but trouble doesn't look like shouting. Sometimes, trouble just looks like a quiet woman with the right passwords. If they gave me a mic, I'd use it, just not the way they expected. The next morning, my phone rang as I was stepping out of the elevator into the office. The number was familiar, Dad's cell. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but something in me, curiosity, maybe spite, made me pick up. He didn't say hello. "What's going on, Alessia? Teresa says you're interfering with logistics. The jet, the retreat. What the hell are you doing?" I kept my voice flat. "I'm applying internal compliance, nothing more." He was quiet for a second, then sighed. "You know," he said, "your sister's always been the likable one. Easy to work with, no drama. You make people tense." It landed like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I'd heard versions of that for most of my life. "You're too intense. Can you not take everything so seriously? It's just a joke." Those phrases were like wallpaper in our family's home, always there, part of the decor. So I said nothing. Let the silence do the talking. He didn't even ask if what Teresa said was true, just accepted her version and ran with it. "I'm in meetings," I said, then hung up before he could say anything else. After lunch, I checked my inbox and found a message from Paige, a friend from college who still volunteered with the Carter Foundation. "Just wanted to say hi, and wow, love that you're on the gala list. Didn't know you were speaking. So cool." I blinked. I wasn't on any list. She forwarded the digital invite. I clicked the link. There it was. Carter Foundation Annual Gala. Featured guests: Teresa Calvin, Dorian Molesky, Loretta Calvin, and Alyssa McKinnon. I stared at the name. It wasn't a typo. It wasn't even close enough to be accidental. It was a version of me that didn't exist. And she, this fictional shadow of me, was seated at a table labeled Extended Sponsors and Staff. A polite way of saying, not family. No mention of my role. No reference to the jet fleet that carried their events. No context. They didn't even bother to ask if I was coming, I muttered aloud. They just wrote me in like a footnote, a detail they had to acknowledge legally, so they turned me into a shadow to soften the edges. I scrolled down and saw the RSVP button. There were options to confirm attendance, select a meal, and, at the bottom, a checkbox. Interested in delivering brief remarks, subject to approval. I checked it. A minute later, an auto response came back. Thank you, Alyssa. Your request to speak has been approved. Topic: Legacy. I closed the tab. They wanted me muted, misnamed, parked at the edge of their curated narrative. Instead, I was walking in with my real name and their real story. Not the version they rehearsed for the press. Not the version with ribbon cuttings and foundation slogans. The one with spreadsheets, with shell companies, with the daughter who built the runway under their feet. I booked my flight to Charleston for the gala weekend. Not on their jet, on mine. And I wasn't finished speaking. Not yet. The room was hushed, an unnatural quiet for a Carter event. For a family that prided itself on appearances and practiced applause like it was part of the bloodline, the silence felt like a power shift. I could feel Teresa watching me from her seat. Her hands probably still warm from the standing ovation she received just minutes earlier. The applause that wasn't meant for her. Not really. But I let that slide. Because the real show was about to begin. I took a slow breath and let my voice carry. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Legacy is a word we like to toss around, I said. We print it on brochures, hang it behind podiums, weave it into mission statements. But here's the thing. Legacy isn't just a name. It's who built the foundation you're standing on. Someone shifted in their seat. I didn't look. Aviation partnerships, I continued. That phrase gets thrown around too. Teresa mentioned her work with regional logistics in a recent interview, called it a family project. But I'd like to clarify a few things. A few people straightened up. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single folder. Thick, stapled, time-stamped. This is the original incorporation contract for Elite Airfield Systems, dated 3 years ago. My name appears on every line. Registration, vendor sourcing, capital structuring. I negotiated the first private jet lease before anyone else in this room even knew the company existed. My voice didn't shake. Teresa did not design the system. She didn't build the logistics software, didn't sign the contracts, didn't manage the security team that screens every passenger on every elite flight. That was me. Still no reaction from the front table. Just polished smiles starting to slip. I closed the folder gently, letting the sound echo just enough. I've stayed quiet out of respect. For the family, for the image, for the illusion that we've all been rowing in the same direction. But when you build the boat and someone else tries to steer it into photo ops, you eventually have to grab the oar back. I looked at Mom. She didn't blink. I looked at Dad. He adjusted his cufflink, a habit of his when he's uncomfortable. I looked at Dorian. He was sipping water, slow, calculated. And then I looked at Teresa. She gave me a smile, brittle at the edges. The kind that says, let's talk about this later, in front of 100 people. Too late. Before I step off this stage, I'll say this, I added, my voice softening. If you want to celebrate legacy, start by acknowledging who actually laid the bricks. Applause didn't come immediately. Just a few hesitant claps from the back. One from someone near the bar. It grew from there, awkward and reluctant, like the crowd was trying to decide if it was safe to agree with me yet. I stepped down slowly, walked past the tables, past the marketing director from the family firm who used to pretend not to remember my name, past Aunt Evelyn, who once said at Thanksgiving, "Alessia's more of a background type, don't you think?" I walked right past the family table, and as I passed Teresa, I heard her whisper, "You made your point." I didn't stop, but I did answer. "No," I said without turning. "I just started telling the story right." But doing better meant being ready for retaliation. By the time I got back to my hotel suite, the buzz of the gala had already started bleeding into local press. Someone had live-streamed part of my speech. A trimmed-down clip was already circulating. Me at the podium, saying, "If you want to celebrate legacy, start by acknowledging who actually laid the bricks." That line was now the headline on a small Charleston news site. Comments ranged from, "Finally someone said it," to, "Why bring drama to a fundraiser?" I knew how these things worked. The truth always came wrapped in controversy, especially when it was delivered by the person everyone had agreed should be quiet. I showered, answered a few emails, declined a calendar invite from a foundation subcommittee meeting I had never agreed to attend in the first place. Around midnight, I was just about to turn off the lights when my phone lit up. Dorian. Of course. I let it ring twice before picking up. Look, he started, tone already defensive. I get it. You were hurt. You did what you had to do, and honestly, you were right about the Montrose thing. I messed up. I didn't say anything. But we can fix this, he added quickly. Just need a little help. Not even long-term. Short-term access to the trust account, just to show investors everything's still in order. There it was. Not regret. A request. Not an apology. A transaction. He wasn't sorry. He was strategic. Always had been. When we were kids, he once told me, if you admit to being wrong fast enough, people stop asking questions. He'd lived by that rule. Made it an art. Like the time he crashed Mom's Lexus into the neighbor's fence, blamed it on a stray dog, and somehow convinced everyone I had distracted him. I spent 2 weekends grounded while he played basketball and got congratulated for staying calm under pressure. Nothing had changed. You didn't call to apologize, I said. You called to negotiate. Silence on the line. I just need to show that I still have access. And you don't, I cut in, because you breached the agreement. Multiple times. That was years ago. And yet, here you are. Same behavior, different watch. You really want to air all this in front of investors? He snapped, dropping the performance. I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. Funny, I replied. You weren't worried about public image when you were funneling fake invoices through shell vendors. He hung up. No drama, no slam. Just a quiet click. I set my phone down and turned back to my laptop, logged into the Family Trust Management portal. Located Dorian's access permissions. Clicked Revoke. Reason for removal. Repeated breach of fiduciary responsibility. A message popped up. Are you sure you want to proceed? I clicked yes. For years, I'd been told to stay in line, to play my part, to let the men handle the numbers while the women handled the image. But now I was handling both. They wanted me to act like I was part of the family business, so I did, just better, and I still hadn't played my final card. At 8:03 a.m. sharp, my phone lit up. The name on the screen was Jill, Elite's head of operations. She only called when it mattered. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the shift beneath it. Ms. McKinnon, we've received confirmation from ground crew. The Carter jet is locked. Hangar access revoked. Pilots requesting override. I glanced at the time on my laptop, still open from earlier. They're asking if this is an error. It's not, I said, standing from my chair and moving toward the window. It's business. There was a pause. Then Jill simply said, Understood, and hung up. I let the phone fall into my palm and stared out at the tarmac in the distance. Tiny planes like silver insects taxiing slowly under the morning light. From my view, the world looked organized, predictable, like rules had meaning again. One tap. That's all it took. One tap in a system I had designed from scratch. All access marked, temporarily restricted. Crew scheduling, frozen. Fuel authorization, revoked. Onboard Wi-Fi, disconnected. Passenger manifest, sealed. The note on their charter file read, pending compliance with internal audit and verified chain of command. That clause had been there from the beginning. No one reads the fine print. Not when they think they're family. Not when they believe their last name is the only clearance they need. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a scene. No angry emails. No emotional fallout. Just a keystroke. Just the same tool they handed me when they tried to ignore I existed. I leaned over the counter in my office kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and whispered to myself, always read the fine print. That phrase used to be a joke in our family. Dad would say it whenever a bill came in with hidden fees or Mom's magazine subscription auto-renewed without warning. But it stopped being a joke when I realized I was the fine print, the part they skimmed past until they needed something. Then suddenly, I was expected to be available, agreeable, invisible. Not anymore. This used to feel like betrayal. Now it felt like liberation. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply no longer paying the price for their comfort. If they wanted the power of my resources, they had to follow my structure. No more shortcuts. No more smiling through slights. No more pretending everything's fine, just because we share blood. If they wanted to fly again, they'd have to ask. And if they didn't, well, then they'd sit grounded. Same way they made me sit for years, while they passed around credit that belonged elsewhere. My assistant, Rachel, messaged me 10 minutes later. Teresa just attempted to charter through a third-party broker in Singapore. Different email, same passenger manifest. We flagged it. Access denied. I smiled. Because it wasn't just the Carter Teat GD we're locked out of. It was the entire structure. Every thread they used to pull with a wink and a phone call, cut. I had rebuilt everything they once claimed. They said I made things complicated. They called me difficult, emotional, unlikable. But the truth is, they just didn't like not being in control. They weren't used to playing by rules they didn't write. And now they were outside the system, looking in, including the page they tried to erase. The file came through on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was in my office, halfway through my second cup of coffee, when Carol's text buzzed across my screen. Found this on an old camera before I wipe it. Thought you should see. Attached was a short video. No context, no file name, just a timestamp, April 18th, 2006. I opened it out of habit. What I wasn't prepared for was the sound, soft laughter, clinking glasses, and someone singing off-key in the background. The camera panned shakily across a garden party. Paper lanterns, folding chairs, plastic forks. Probably Mom's 60th. I recognized the tablecloths, cream with navy trim. She used only once before declaring they clashed with her aesthetic. Then the camera settled on me. 16. Awkward braces. Holding a folded sheet of paper. I was standing near the edge of the pool, hesitating. "Mom," I said softly, "can I? Just a few words?" She was smiling in another direction, glass of white wine in hand, laughing at something Aunt Evelyn had said. "Alessia, not now." "Please, it's just a short thank you." And then came the part that hit harder than I expected. "If you can't be quiet, don't expect to be around long." My breath caught watching it. I knew the words were real. I remembered how they made me feel. But hearing them again, outside the haze of memory, felt different. The camera swung away as if nothing had happened. I saw myself lower the paper. I didn't cry. I just disappeared into the background, silently, obediently. 2 minutes later, they sang Happy Birthday and cut the cake. No one noticed. I watched the entire clip again, then again. And something in me cracked, not from pain, but from confirmation. It wasn't a one-off moment. It was a lesson. That day, I learned the cost of voice. I learned that silence was currency in our family, and if I wanted to stay, I had to keep the volume down. For years, I thought I was being dramatic for holding on to it. Now, I realized, I had simply been trained to vanish politely. I never finished that speech. I couldn't even remember what it was supposed to say. But I do remember the feeling. That sinking sense that nothing I said would ever matter, unless it made someone else look better. And that moment, 16 years old, rejected in front of a crowd that barely registered it, wasn't isolated. It was foundational. They didn't silence me. They taught me how to silence myself. Until now. I downloaded the clip, renamed it The Blueprint, and moved it to my encrypted archive. Then I uploaded it into the Trust's legal folder. Quietly, without commentary. Not to weaponize it, but to remind myself what I overcame. If they ever tried to drag me back into the shadows again, into some courtroom or public smear campaign, I wanted the record to reflect exactly where this pattern started. I closed my laptop and leaned back, letting the weight of it settle in my chest. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry. What I felt was clarity. the kind you only get when you stop trying to rewrite the past and start preserving it instead. Especially not the final chapter of my own legacy. I was at my desk the next morning, sipping lukewarm coffee and scanning a vendor contract when the envelope arrived. It wasn't dropped off by courier. No digital ping or certified mail alert. Just a plain manila envelope, no return address, no handwriting on the front. It was sitting on the security desk downstairs. The receptionist handed it to me like it was nothing, but I knew. The weight of it said otherwise. I took it upstairs, peeled back the flap, and found 2 documents inside. A copy of my grandfather's will, and stapled to it, a trust amendment dated 6 years ago. I read the first page, then again slower, tracing each line like it might suddenly change. The original document named me, Alessia McKinnon, as the majority heir to the Carter family's holding company. The amendment removed me, replaced me with Dorian and Teresa. No rationale, no conversation, just a signature at the bottom. My mother's. I sat very still, staring at it, not blinking. I remembered the day she had me sign routine updates. I was 30, fresh out of my MBA program. I'd just passed my private pilot exam. I was full of optimism and corporate etiquette. She came to my condo with a leather folder and a glass of white wine. "This will simplify things," she said, as I flipped through the pages. "Just some legal streamlining, nothing to worry about." I didn't question her. Why would I? Back then, I still thought trust was something you earned once and got to keep. But trust, I've learned, is a document, not a feeling. They didn't take me out in rage or scandal. They didn't strip me publicly. They just edited me out. Silently, efficiently, and they did it knowing I wouldn't fight it, because I still believed being good was the same as being protected. I picked up the original will and scanned it into my encrypted drive. Then I did the same with the amendment. Both files were saved under a new folder. Restoration. Not retribution, just clarity. Next, I sent a message to my estate attorney. "Prepare a full shareholder audit. I want every change tracked. Signatures, timestamps, who knew what and when." She replied within minutes. "Understood. Initiating review." No drama, no confrontation. They'd written me out without a word, so I would let the paper speak now. Paper doesn't forget. And this time, neither would I. I wasn't going to burn the family empire. I didn't need to. I already owned its foundation. The audit wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. If they wanted to keep building stories, they'd need to answer for the chapters they rewrote without me. I closed the legal portal, pushed my chair back, and stood by the window. They thought I was too emotional, too stubborn, too difficult. But what they underestimated most was my memory. And the law. They'd made me sign away my birthright. But I'd signed something, too, years ago, when I chose to stop asking for approval. Now I was taking it back, line by line, clause by clause. They'd buried the truth beneath layers of signatures and polished language. But I wasn't just reading between the lines. I was rewriting them. Now it was just me, and the silence I'd finally made mine. I woke up that morning before the alarm. The air was still, the kind of early quiet that felt earned. I slipped out of bed, brewed coffee, and sat by the window overlooking the city, steel and glass, humming with purpose, none of it waiting for permission. At 7:05, I logged into the Elite Systems backend. 3 names: Teresa Calvin, Dorian Molesky, Loretta Calvin. I hovered the cursor over each and clicked Revoke Access. One by one, like removing keys from a ring I never agreed to carry. Under Reason for Action, I typed internal conflict, breach of ethics, financial obfuscation. Simple, impersonal, corporate. The way they liked it. No emails, no announcement, no confrontation, just clean execution. The kind they once praised me for in business settings. Efficient, unemotional, reliable. This time, it was used on them. By 7:45, the first call came in. Teresa. I didn't answer. A second call. Voicemail. What are you doing, Alessia? This is family. You've made your point. Call me back. Then Dorian texted. Unlock the damn jet. You got your speech. Don't push it. Even Mom tried. Just a missed call. No voicemail. As usual, she couldn't bring herself to speak when it mattered. I didn't respond, because this wasn't about a single plane or one retreat. This was about the system they'd spent decades exploiting, and the woman they underestimated long enough to think she'd never touch the switches. They thought I'd lash out, break down, call for a family meeting, offer one last speech about fairness. Instead, I sent one email. Subject: Carter Family System Access Update. Recipients: Family Group Thread. All Carter access to elite systems remains restricted pending legal audit. Any attempt to circumvent system restrictions will result in automatic federal reporting via Compliance Protocol 8B. For questions, please consult legal representation. I pressed send. Then I archived the thread, blocked the thread, turned off notifications. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked out of the apartment. By the time I got to the elevator, the sun had fully broken through the skyline. Light spilled across the metal doors, warm and unapologetic. I took a deep breath. Their empire was still standing, but it stood on frozen ground now. And I wasn't the outsider anymore. The inconvenient daughter. The one too sensitive to be in the room. I was in the room, at the head of the table, with the passwords, the contracts, the legal trail that built the walls they never thought I'd enter. And they were locked out, watching from a distance as the machine they took credit for started closing its doors, without a sound, without a fight. Just policy and power. And a woman they tried to reduce to a footnote. The difference was, this time, the systems they once used to keep me quiet were the very ones telling them, access denied. Now it was just me, and the silence I'd finally made mine. For the first time in years, I woke without dread clawing at my chest. No barrage of notifications, no buzzing calendar reminders, or vague meeting invites laced with unspoken expectations. The apartment was quiet, sun just beginning to rise behind sheer curtains, casting long, pale stripes across the floor. My breath was steady. I could hear it, really hear it. Inhale, exhale, simple, human. The morning came without fanfare. No alarms, no pings, no urgent subject lines screaming urgent in bold red. I moved slowly but deliberately, dressed in quiet layers, packed only what I needed. No extra chargers for other people's devices, no presentation backups. Just my laptop, a leather notebook, a pen I liked, and the weightless sense that maybe I was finally, actually free. By the time I reached the airport, the city was shaking itself awake. Taxis honked more out of rhythm than necessity. Pedestrians wrapped in trench coats and headphones moved like small currents, feeding into the larger tide of motion. But I wasn't headed to the usual terminal. Not Gate 47 with its burnt coffee smell and fluorescent buzz. This time, I was going through the executive wing, silent elevators, polished corridors, frosted glass. I took a seat in the lounge, warm cup of ginger tea in hand, and looked out across the tarmac. There it was. Hangar 14. Their jet. Motionless. Unattended. A $65 million monument to stillness. Polished to a high mirror shine, its nose pointed at nothing in particular. Fueled, maintained, and absolutely going nowhere. It sat like a paused idea. Once urgent, now irrelevant. It reminded me of how I used to feel. Ready. Capable. Waiting for someone else to clear me for takeoff. To grant me permission to be powerful. I had all the tools, the discipline, the drive. But I stayed grounded, because their version of leadership only had room for one pilot at a time, and I wasn't ever supposed to be that pilot. But now I wasn't on the tarmac, I was in the air. Rachel approached, tablet in hand, steps as confident and composed as ever. All set for Singapore, she said. Board meeting confirmed. Logistics group will dial in post-session. I nodded, eyes still on the hanger. "Thank you." She hesitated. A flicker of something unspoken passed across her face. "Teresa tried again this morning. Different login. New shell account." I barely blinked. "And?" "Blocked within seconds." Of course it was. They were still trying to rewrite the story, still clinging to a version of events where I was the problem, and they were the architects of order. Still looking for back doors into a system they thought they owned. But I'd rebuilt the system. Without them. With walls and windows where I chose them to be. I didn't flinch. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even angry. Because this wasn't about punishing them anymore. That chapter closed months ago, maybe years ago, and I just hadn't realized it until now. This had become about release, about stepping out of a structure that only worked if I kept my head down and played small, about claiming a life that didn't require me to shrink in order to fit. I stood by the window longer, watching the world move. Service crews rolled catering carts across the tarmac. Other jets taxied with purpose, their engines low and steady. People came and went. Transactions happened, routes initiated, lives expanded. And this time, so was mine. I used to believe peace came through reconciliation, that if I waited long enough, if I kept proving my value without causing disruption, they'd eventually notice. That someday we'd be around a long table, joking over drinks about misunderstandings and timing, like characters in a well-edited holiday movie. I held on to that idea like a keepsake. But peace, real peace, doesn't come from being understood. It comes from not needing to be. I considered writing one last message. Not to accuse, not to ignite, just to speak plainly. I loved you all, I just couldn't keep loving you quietly. I typed it, read it, then archived it alongside other things I'd kept. Not to use, but to remember. The blueprint video that changed everything, the original will, the audit logs, a soft record of truth, not vengeance. Because part of healing is keeping the receipts, not for revenge, but for remembrance. For the next time someone tries to make you doubt your memory. For the times you almost convince yourself it wasn't that bad. For your own clarity. Rachel returned with coffee. Jets prepped. Crews finalizing the route. We're good to go. I took the cup and smiled. Let's fly. She smiled back. The air's clear. We walked through the corridor together, past private lounges and doors that had once required a last name I didn't have, or a favor I refused to call in. Past plaques bearing names of legacy donors I used to serve behind the scenes, making sure their seating was correct and their requests discreetly met while someone else collected the credit. At the base of the stairs, I paused. The jet gleamed. My name was on the manifest, not as a guest, not as staff. As the principal. I turned and looked back across the tarmac. Hangar 14 was still there. Unmoving, unmanned. Just steel and stillness. A monument to inertia. I inhaled. Held it. Released. Some lessons never take off. But I did. Hi, I'm Magnus. I used to believe that being the quiet one in the family meant I was safe, until my parents sent a voicemail telling me I was out of the family business. No meeting, no warning, just their voices, cold and rehearsed, like it'd been removed from a mailing list. But that wasn't the worst part. It was what came after. The name I wasn't supposed to see removed from the contract. The loan I never signed, but somehow backed the photo, cracked across my face, mailed with no return address. And then 89 missed calls. What makes a family choose silence over honesty? And when they erase you quietly, do you disappear or do you start writing your own ending? It started at 6:42 in the morning, a time too early for bad news, but apparently just right for betrayal. The snow hadn't stopped falling all night, teeny, slow flakes piling on the ledge outside my kitchen window in Spokane. I hadn't touched my coffee yet. It was still hot, but barely. I remember the way the mug felt in my hand when my phone buzzed once, screen lighting up with a missed call from Homeline and a new voicemail. I didn't think much of it. Maybe Mom reminding me to pick up groceries or some last-minute meeting prep. I tapped play. Her voice came through measured, flat, rehearsed. Hi, we've decided to restructure the company. Effective immediately, you're no longer part of the business. You'll be hearing from our attorney. No good morning, no Magnus, not even a breath of discomfort. That was it. Just that one message. My name wasn't spoken, not even once. The hum of the refrigerator behind me grew louder than the rest of the room. It was as if the walls, the floor, the world knew something had shifted and were politely stepping back to let it happen. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just stood there, holding that cooling mug like it could anchor me to something that wasn't vanishing in real time. I hit replay. Slower, still no mistake, still no warmth. Still not even my name. I sat down at the kitchen table, phone on the counter, voicemail still open. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, the stillness they all pressed in. I thought about every late night I spent fixing payroll when no one else even knew it was broken. About the times I refinanced my own condo to cover vendor delays without ever submitting it as a company expense. About the 3 a.m. calls I answered when Dad panicked over line item discrepancies, and the weekends I gave up when Valora was too busy preparing for investor photo shoots. None of that seemed to matter anymore. I had been erased. Efficiently. Quietly. I opened my laptop. There it was. The Q4 annual review deck. I clicked through the slides until I got to the part I knew they wouldn't delete because it was too polished to throw out. My project, my financial model, the risk mitigation strategy I'd worked on during the flu, curled up with tissues and spreadsheets. And there was my face in the background photo, no less. Still cropped just enough to keep me anonymous. Below the slide, bold font, led by Valora Rhodes, Executive Vision. They had taken my work, my image, and stapled her name to it. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the laptop. I simply dragged the corner of the screen, hit screenshot, and saved it to a folder I hadn't touched in years. A folder I created after the first time they forgot to include me in a board decision. The folder was called Just in Case. That night, lying awake, I replayed the voicemail again. The delivery, the finality, the indifference. I remembered being 24, standing on the cold factory floor with shoes too new and a clipboard too full. Valora was in New York then, getting a crash course in branding while I was figuring out how to read vendor contracts and calculate gross margins. They always said she had the look. Apparently, I had the silence. And I wore it well. Over the years, I took on everything they didn't want to handle: procurement, logistics, taxes. They called me the backbone, the numbers girl, the fixer. Funny how the backbone gets removed when the face wants all the credit. I didn't call back. I didn't reply. Instead, I copied the voicemail file to my encrypted drive. Opened QuickBooks from 3 fiscal years ago. Not to fix anything, but to remember the patterns, the timelines, the debt moves, the silent saves. If they wanted to pretend I was never there, I wasn't going to beg to be drawn back in. I was going to document every inch of the ground I stood on, and if they tried to bulldoze it, they'd trip on everything I left buried under their own names. I opened a blank document, titled it Audit 2023-2024, Internal Memo. Then, before typing a single word, I hit play on the voicemail once more. Not to hear the words, but to remember the tone. Because when betrayal comes in pearls and parent tones, you don't scream back. You build silence that costs. I walked in without a badge, and still no one stopped me. They barely looked up. My heels tapped against the polished floor of the Spokane Convention Center, echoing louder than any of the polite background jazz playing in the ballroom. I moved with the same deliberate confidence I used when negotiating vendor terms, even if my stomach turned knots behind the facade. I hadn't planned to attend the gala. The invitation arrived 2 days prior, no title, no greeting, just Ms. A. Rhodes in generic font, shoved into an unsealed envelope. No mention of the role I played in saving the company from collapse that year. But curiosity has its own gravity. And so, I walked in. Alone. The check-in woman didn't recognize me. She handed me a name tag and gestured toward the banquet layout. I scanned for my table 19. It sat tucked behind a wide decorative column near the back of the room. As I approached, it became unmistakably clear. The table was directly adjacent to the restroom entrance. I could hear toilet flushes and bursts of awkward laughter filtering through each time the door swung open. The seat backs were too close to the service corridor. Every time a server passed by, I felt the vibration in the floor. One of them, a kid maybe 22, leaned down and asked with a smile, "Mom, are you with catering?" I stared at him long enough that he shifted awkwardly and walked off without waiting for an answer. At the front of the room, a spotlight flared to life. Valora appeared on stage, draped in navy satin, hair pinned into an elegant twist. The MC introduced her as the woman behind Vanden's remarkable financial turnaround. I felt the sting long before the applause started. I didn't clap. Not when the screen behind her lit up with slides I had designed. Not when her voice ran over every milestone metric I had calibrated, every forecast had personally refined at 2 in the morning while she was in Miami on brand alignment. She was celebrated as a visionary. I was seated next to the bathroom. That applause didn't sound like praise. It sounded like a door clicking shut. The next morning, I brewed my own coffee at home, stood by the window, while the snow softened the edges of the street. I logged into my bank app out of routine. No deposit. It was February 3rd. Payday. Vandeen had always deposited by 6 a.m., no exception. I waited an hour. Still nothing. I called HR. After 2 reroutes and 1 accidental disconnect, someone finally answered. "We were told finance was consolidating payroll functions," she said hesitantly. "Your profile was marked as inactive." I stood still. "I built that payroll system," I said, more to myself than to her. But she had already moved on to ending the call. I didn't cry. I walked 4 miles home from downtown that evening instead of taking a cab. The cold burned against my cheeks, but I welcomed it. I needed to feel something that wasn't quiet betrayal. In my apartment, I dropped the gala pamphlet on the floor, kicked off my boots, and walked straight to my desk. I pulled up my encrypted drive, opened the folder labeled Contingency. I renamed it Exit Strategy. I took a screenshot of my empty bank history, time-stamped 7:04 a.m., February 3rd. Dragged it into the folder, then added a scanned image of the Table 19 layout from the gala program. I wasn't compiling revenge. I was compiling evidence. Not for them. For me. Because if I ever questioned whether I was overreacting, I needed proof that I wasn't. I needed reminders that I wasn't imagining things. On my nightstand, the name tag from the gala still sat untouched. I picked it up, stared at the cheap plastic badge with my name printed in half-broken ink. I didn't throw it away. I didn't keep it. I opened the drawer of my desk, dropped it in, and shut it softly. Then I pulled out a yellow post-it, scribbled 7 words. "You told me I don't belong. Let's see how well you survive without my shadow holding your walls up." I folded it once, tucked it inside the Exit Strategy folder. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't check my email before bed. And somehow, sleep came easier than it had any right to. I wasn't invited to the next meeting either. I showed up anyway. I didn't knock when I walked into the strategy meeting. I didn't need to. They all looked up, startled but silent, like they'd seen a ghost step through the doorway in full daylight. I didn't stay long, just long enough to drop a revised financial outline on the table, the same one Valora had been butchering for weeks. I turned and left before anyone found their voice. Later that afternoon, I stopped by my father's house to drop off a tax document he'd forgotten to sign. It was supposed to be a quick exchange, nothing more than a handoff at the door. He waved me in with a distracted grunt, already walking toward the den. That was Clyde never cruel, never kind, just absent in all the ways that mattered. On my way through the entry hall, I spotted it sitting neatly on the console table below the framed photo of him and Valora at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The Omega watch. Black dial, leather band, vintage-styled clasp. I had saved for 8 months to buy that watch. It wasn't the price that made it valuable. It was what it meant, or what I thought it meant. Clyde glanced back and said casually, "Your sister got me that a while back." Thoughtful, huh? I didn't correct him. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, offered a tight smile, and looked away before the sting could crawl too far up my face. My throat burned, but my voice held. That kind of discipline becomes muscle memory after a while. I didn't stay for coffee. I left before he remembered I was still in the room. Driving home, I let the heater run too high, hoping the dry air would suck out the weight in my chest. But my mind didn't cooperate. It wandered back, stubborn as ever. 8 years ago, I had given him that watch the week I received my first bonus as assistant controller. He'd missed an important flight a few days earlier, something about a busted clasp and a dead battery. I remembered wrapping the box myself, handwriting the tag. "So you're never late for your life." His reaction back then? A distracted thanks, maybe a half smile. He'd set it aside while answering an email about a board seat he was angling for. I told myself he was just tired, that he appreciated it in his own quiet way. But sitting there in traffic, all I could think was, did he ever even remember I gave it to him? I didn't want an answer. When I got back to my apartment, I kicked off my boots, dropped my bag, and went straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. My phone buzzed twice. Unknown number, then a text. It was from Rosa. I hadn't heard from her since she retired 3 years ago. She used to keep the house running while we all lived under one roof. Rosa was more than staff. She was the one who slipped me aspirin when I had cramps, and Valora was out getting her nails done. The one who saw things no one else thought she noticed. Her message was simple. A voice note. I sat down before I pressed play. "Honey," she whispered, voice raspy, "I remember Mr. Rhodes signing that paper for you. The inheritance one. Before he passed. Your mother. She told me to keep it quiet. I shouldn't have, but I thought you'd want to know." I stared at the screen, not breathing. She meant the will, the original one. The version I found hidden in a folder 2 weeks ago. The one that named me as having 40% ownership. Unencumbered. Legally binding. Supposedly. But it had never been filed. The family lawyer claimed it was superseded. That changes had been made. No explanation. Just smooth deflection. That night, Rosa was referring to, it had to be right after the funeral. I remembered that evening. The air thick with grief and obligation. I'd gone to bed early. My mother had stayed in the study alone, said she needed to organize things. No one questioned her. She handled the estate, always had. We let her, we trusted her. Now I wondered if she'd spent that night doing more than organizing. Maybe she'd buried the truth in a locked drawer. Maybe she'd always planned to rewrite the ending before anyone else could read it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even call Rosa back. Instead, I opened the fireproof safe in my closet. Inside, beneath a layer of legal files and encrypted backups, was my certified copy of the original will. I took it out and laid it flat on the dining table. Next to it, I placed a small USB drive. On it, Rosa's voicemail, saved and backed up. Then, from the kitchen drawer, I retrieved the gala brochure, the one with Valora's speech, the one where she'd been credited for my entire fiscal recovery plan. Her name, my numbers, her face, my strategy. I slipped it under the will and the drive. I wasn't gathering mementos. I was building a case. I didn't need a stage. I didn't need applause. I just needed the truth to be documented before someone tried to set it on fire. They thought I was collecting dust. I was constructing the fuse. And when someone steals from you long enough, you stop asking for it back. You start planning how to take the whole room. I didn't write back to her reply. I submitted my own. By the time Marjorie finally responded to my pointed little email, her tone was polished into something that read like concern, but felt like control. "Let's clarify everything together, dear. I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding." I didn't bite. I had no interest in clarity served with condescension. Instead, I spread both versions of the will out on my kitchen table that Friday morning, sunlight leaking through the blinds and onto Clyde's familiar, stoic signature. The original, the one I found tucked inside Grandpa's storage bin, was clear and clean. 40% ownership to Magnus Rhodes. Unencumbered. The updated version filed through the family's estate attorney had me missing completely. It was as if I had never existed. I held both side by side. No legal jargon could explain it away. No oversight could justify the precision in my erasure. That was no accident. The night after Grandpa's funeral came back to me with sharp edges. We'd all gone quiet after the reception, that long afternoon of polite condolences and stiff hands on shoulders. I remember Marjorie announcing she needed space, saying, "I'll be in the study. Please don't disturb me." The drawer where she kept estate records had always been locked. Back then, it didn't occur to me to question why. Clyde hadn't asked either. He never did. Whatever Marjorie declared became family protocol. Now I saw it for what it was, a controlled edit of legacy, made behind a closed door while everyone else was still grieving. By early afternoon, I called the estate attorney, posing as if I just wanted clarification on a minor tax clause. He was too polite to sense danger. "I've sent over the official summary," he said. "Let me know if anything looks off. Though, do note the phrasing, your portion is marked as pending under performance-based review." I blinked. "Performance-based review?" I repeated. "Yes. It's language your mother requested. Kind of a flexible clause. Keeps things fair. That word again. I ended the call without asking more. I'd already learned everything I needed. Suspended. My inheritance wasn't gone. It was pending performance, as if my bloodline had a probationary period. I went digging. In the back of my storage cabinet was an old tax folder dated the year Grandpa passed. Slipped inside was a post-it, Marjorie's handwriting looped in neat cursive. Update with family priorities first. It was clipped to a printed draft of the will, the same draft I had now in my hand. I sat back in my chair, letting the weight of it land. Not just betrayal, but calculation. This wasn't a family error. It was a strategy. I didn't call her. I didn't storm in. I wrote an email, not frantic, not demanding. Found the original grandfather clause while sorting old files. Will let you know if I find any inconsistencies. That was it. No exclamation points, no emotion, just implication wrapped in grammar sharp enough to draw blood. Then I started the real work. I indexed every document I had ever been cut from. Financial reports where my signature disappeared. Organizational charts where my title shifted to a dotted line. Photos from press events where it had been cropped out just enough to keep the symmetry, but lose the person. Every piece told a story. Every omission had a timestamp. They thought it'd crumble. They thought it'd spiral or beg. But they forgot something critical. You don't push out the person who built the firewall. You just teach her where to dig. I renamed the drive. Again. This time, undeniable. Because the difference between being forgotten and being erased is that the latter comes with evidence, and I was done forgetting. They didn't just ignore the warning. They took it as a dare. And now, it's my turn. I walked into the quarterly review meeting without fanfarino greeting. No badge, no name placard. Just me and my steps. Steady, unbothered. No one stopped me. No one asked who I was. Either they truly believed I wouldn't come back, or they were hoping I'd be too humiliated to show my face. Both options revealed everything I needed to know. I chose a seat in the back, near the wall right behind the CFO's assistant. The same seat they used to put the interns in. That symbolic corner of the room where eyes don't wander, where voices stay quiet. But I didn't flinch. Valora stood at the front, owning the room like she'd been born in it. Her voice carried the smooth charm of a practiced politician, rehearsed, polished, pleasant. She smiled toward the webcam, where investors dialed in from across the globe, gesturing at the bright screen behind her. The image was clean, professional, a sleek slideshow of Van Dien's so-called next chapter. The main slide read, "Strategic investment, Innovation through leadership. And then came the Photo new 3D printer line. Flagship equipment we couldn't even dream of affording half a year ago. Yet, somehow, here it was, already installed and functioning. In large part, Valora said, clasping her hands together like a seasoned keynote speaker, this expansion was made possible through a generous contribution I secured from a key stakeholder relationship. Their belief in our future allowed us to pivot quickly and elevate our capabilities. The words hung in the air like perfume. Beautiful, impressive, and completely false. Because I knew the truth. That stakeholder relationship she mentioned? That was me. The funding for that printer came from an emergency operations reserve, my private LLC. A quiet contribution I never even filed for reimbursement, because at the time, they needed it more than I needed credit. And Valora? She had rewritten the script, stamped her name on the invoice, claimed the glory with zero hesitation. Not a glance in my direction, not even a pause. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my hand. I simply watched, observed, took mental notes, the kind that get filed, not forgotten. Because at the bottom right of that slide, the one with the printer photo, I spotted something most wouldn't notice. A faded string of numbers embedded in the corner. A procurement code I had memorized long ago. The same one that traced back to my bank account. The meeting ended with polite applause. Some stayed behind for polite chatter, others packed up fast. When the head of procurement began sliding his tablet into a briefcase, I walked up. Calm, unshaken. I handed him a paper copy of the original invoice. It was printed, highlighted, noted. On top was a single yellow sticky note. Incorrect recipient listed in internal report. For correction. That was all. No confrontation, no accusation. Just the facts. He looked at the paper like it was radioactive, like he could feel the ripple this could cause, but hadn't yet done the math on how far it would spread. I didn't stay long enough for him to finish the equation. Back home, I replayed the live stream of the meeting slowly, frame by frame. I zoomed in on the slide again, and there it was. Lower corner, nearly hidden in red. Draft 1, AArch, revised, crossed out. Replaced by Valora, final. They didn't even bother deleting the version history. Just renamed it and called it their own. I took a screenshot. Dragged it into a digital folder I'd quietly been building for months. I called it Exit Strategy. Then I opened a new document. Legal letterhead, formal formatting, precision language. I addressed it not to the board, not to Valora, but directly to Vandin's legal counsel. In the letter, I detailed invoice discrepancies, procurement misattributions, reputational risks tied to inaccurate crediting of financial contributions. I never once raised my voice, but every word carried weight. At the bottom, I ended with a sentence as sharp as a scalpel. Please treat this as a request for internal clarification prior to further escalation. And I signed it, plainly. Magnus Rhodes, CPA, shareholder. Then I waited. 1 day, then 2, then 3. No reply. No call. No acknowledgement. Not even a read receipt. What did arrive was a press release complete with stock photos and marketing jargon. Legacy led by Vision. Vandin's next chapter. Authored by Valora, of course. My name? Absent. Again. I didn't slam my laptop. I didn't scream or curse. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and drank it slowly. The sound of each swallow was louder than Valora's entire speech in my mind. They thought their silence would shrink me. They didn't know silence could cut sharper than noise. And as I looked at the screen, at the words she borrowed, and the empire she thought she built, I said it aloud, just once, into the quiet of my apartment. They were warned. Now they'll pay the cost of pretending I was never here. The more they erased me, the louder the paper trail screamed. The email came from a burner domain, but I knew the formatting Vandin used a very specific contract template. Whoever sent it had access to internal systems. The document was attached, unsigned, but embedded metadata showed it had already been finalized and filed. I scrolled to the last page. There, in black and white, authorized signatory family shareholder approval. The line that had once included my name, gone, replaced with Valoris. The co-signature? Quillen's initials, typed in fast, the way you do when you think no one will ever check. I didn't feel shocked. That had expired months ago. What I felt now was precision. I printed the document, 3 copies, stapled, sealed them into a manila envelope. This time, I wasn't drafting polite reminders or carefully worded clarifications. I wasn't submitting emails into the abyss of legal's inbox. This time, I was walking it in myself. I arrived at headquarters just before lunch, just early enough to catch the staff before they disappeared into the cafeteria. I didn't ask for a meeting. I didn't check in with reception. I knew the building. I helped plan its reorg. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, walked straight into the finance suite, and placed the envelope on the CFO's desk. He wasn't there. No one stopped me. Inside the packet, the contract draft, the inheritance clause that Marjorie had forgotten, and a neatly typed letter requesting immediate forensic reconciliation of all financial amendments involving my name. I wrote only 1 sentence in ink at the bottom. This isn't a threat. It's a courtesy. Then I left. On the way down, I stopped at the server console outside the compliance room. Tried to log in. Denied. I dialed the internal extension for data systems. The voice that answered was a young man. I didn't know him. "I'm trying to access the ledger archive," I said calmly. He paused. Your profile's no longer valid. Finance deactivated it during the tier restructure last month." "Did they?" I said, more a statement than a question. They had locked me out of the system I designed. What they didn't realize was, I had built the firewall, but I also knew where the emergency exits were hidden. That night, I went home, pulled out a separate drive I hadn't touched in over a year. It held offline backups, vendor histories, reconciliation reports I had kept for my own sanity during chaotic quarters. I knew how to cross-compare purchase orders, track overpayments, decode soft-coded expense fields. Within 2 hours, I had flagged 2 vendor transactions, double entries, each for 70 grand, labeled as branding deployment. But they weren't tied to any campaign I recognized. I printed those too. Valoris' new public image came with a price, and it looked like they'd paid for it using the kind of budget magic that never survives audit daylight. The next morning, I returned. This time, I didn't walk into finance. I walked into legal. The firm had merged with Vanden's external counsel last year. I handed the envelope to the partner directly. His name was Clay. He wore expensive glasses and a wedding ring he hadn't cleaned since 2019. "I'd like this reviewed under Section 5B of Internal Shareholder Protections," I said, calmly. He looked at the seal. "We weren't notified of any changes." "No," I said, "you weren't." And I left. That evening, I sat on the couch, lights off, phone in hand. It rang just past 9. Quillen. I didn't answer the first time. On the second ring, I picked up. "It wasn't me," he started, breathless. "Valora had legal pre-clearance. She said it was just temporary. The clause was just to streamline things. I didn't interrupt. I didn't know she removed you from the vendor list," he added. "I swear." "You didn't know because you didn't care," I replied. "You never do." He exhaled. "What do you want, Magnus?" For a moment, I stared out the window at the streetlights casting amber shadows on the pavement. "I wanted the truth," I said, my voice steady. "Now I'll settle for evidence." I hung up. By the time they realized I wasn't bluffing, the first audit request had already been submitted, and it wasn't coming from me. They thought it'd crumble, but now they're the ones asking who else they've told. The message came through at 8:17 a.m., tucked between 2 promotional emails about discounted office chairs and a spammy real estate pitch. A forward from Mia Chen, a former marketing assistant who left Vanden last quarter. Subject line: "You didn't get this from me." There was no text in the body, just a single screenshot. At first glance, it looked like any internal Slack conversation. Then I saw the names Valora and a senior executive, Nolan Fields. And the words, "Just wait. She always breaks when she's not seen. Let her feel invisible long enough. She'll quit herself. No ambiguity. No room for misinterpretation." It was about me. My sister, me own blood strategizing psychological erasure, with the elegance of someone commenting on weather patterns. I stared at the screen, letting the glow sting my eyes. Then I opened my notebook, flipped to the last clean page, and wrote in block letters, "Not quitting. Not quiet." The paper wrinkled under my grip. An hour later, I was in my apartment's home office when my old CPA, Jerry, called. "Magnus," he said after a beat too long, "we need to talk. There's a new credit line, it's under your LLC." My stomach didn't drop. It compressed like air being forced out of a sealed chamber. He walked me through it. A $300,000 loan, tagged as support for a Texas expansion project. My name was listed as the silent co-backer. The signature attached to the application? Digitized. "Did you authorize this?" he asked. "I didn't even know it existed," I said. Jerry sighed. "Then we have a problem, not you. We." That was something. I scheduled an appointment at the bank the same afternoon. I walked in with a binder, not a purse. The woman at the front desk asked if I needed a business account manager. I nodded and was led to a glass-walled room where a man in a too-tight tie greeted me like I was an interruption, not a client. "Loan ID 671223, I said. "I need the application documents." He blinked. "You're Ms. Rhodes?" "I am." 20 minutes later, the documents were on the table. 3 pages. Digital approvals. Attached was a trail of internal emails between Vanden's financial liaison and their outsourced funding agent. I skimmed until I reached Quillan's name. "She won't push back. She never does." That was all he wrote. 3 lines above it, Valora's tone was more polished. "Well, loop Magnus in after it's finalized. She has a history of slowing processes." Slowing processes? That's what they called cross-checking legal exposure now? I signed a records release form, collected printed copies of every document, and walked out. At home, I didn't sit down. I moved. Each file got scanned, encrypted, and uploaded into my private legal portal under a new folder, Phase 1 Liability Discovery. Then, I drafted a legal notice to the bank. Not aggressive, just surgical. I did not authorize the loan. My signature is falsified. I am formally requesting forensic verification of all documents bearing my name in this matter. I copied Vanden's board, every last one. That night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it buzz 4 times before I answered. Valora's voice came through tight, clipped, too careful. "Magnus." I didn't let her finish. "You knew." Click. No yelling. No demand. Just that. I didn't need a confrontation. I already had proof. Before I turned in for the night, I called my lawyer, authorized a full audit, uploaded every screenshot, every invoice, every name. I wasn't documenting a grievance. I was building a wall they couldn't climb over or talk their way around. My journal entry that night was brief. They spent years trying to keep me small. This isn't about being seen anymore. It's about making sure they can't hide. The more they tried to keep me quiet, the more I realized silence was their only shield. And I had just broken it. I didn't return their calls. But the audit returned their silence with questions they couldn't bury. It started with a letter from my attorney, 3 pages, tightly worded, and stamped with the firm's seal. The subject line alone was enough to make most boards sweat. Formal notice of forensic inquiry initiated by silent stakeholder. By the end of the week, Vanden's legal team had no choice but to acknowledge receipt. And under mounting pressure from external investors, the board greenlit a full forensic audit. Not a soft internal review, not some PR sweep. A real one with scope, authority, and no filters. The request included everything: financial transfers, historical asset reallocations, silent partner liabilities, especially those linked to my name or LLC. I didn't smile when I got the confirmation. I just exhaled. Finally, I powered down my phone. For 2 days, I let it all sit. No texts, no inbox refresh, no calls. Silence wasn't unfamiliar. It lived in it long enough. But this time, it was intentional. Strategic. When I turned my phone back on, the screen lit up like a warning flare. 89 missed calls. Dozens of texts. Half a dozen voicemails. Almost all from Valora and Quilon. One text said, "Please talk to us before this spreads." Another just said, "You don't have to do this. It's still family." I played one voicemail. Valora's voice cracked before she even said my name. "Magnus, I don't know how this got so far. You should have just talked to us." Talk to them? I'd been talking for years. They just weren't listening. I deleted the voicemail and opened my laptop. The Vanden website had been updated. I navigated straight to the About Us page. There was Clyde, Marjorie, Valora, of course, and a new name-some young strategist out of Chicago. Creative Strategy Officer. I clicked the bio. Mine used to be there, right between Marjorie and Valora, the original architect of the finance model that saved us during the 2019 vendor collapse. Now, erased. Not just my bio, my photo, my title, any trace of me. At the bottom of the page, in small font, established by 3 generations of visionary leadership. I laughed, not out of humor, but relief. They had built their narrative, fully. Now the audit would build mine. 3 days later, I met with my legal team and Daniel's acquisition group in a quiet conference room. No windows, just binders, laptops, evidence. We sat around the table and went line by line. Duplicate payments to a boutique branding agency. 0 documentation. $140,000 unaccounted for. 2 expansion projects reported as internally financed that were actually fronted by falsified credit from my LLC without my signature. Liabilities hidden under creative reinvestment. And the best part? It was all in their handwriting, their emails, their version history. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean in. I let the facts speak louder than anything had said before. Clay, one of the senior attorneys, looked over at me and asked quietly, "Is there anything else you want to add?" I slid one last document across the table. The original clause from Grandpa Will, still valid, still binding. "No," I said. "That's all." That evening, I sat by my window, feet tucked under me, sipping a glass of iced tea I'd forgotten in the freezer long enough for it to turn slushy. Then I wrote my final memo. Not to Vanden, not to Valora, not to the board. I sent it to legal, marked confidential. Subject line, final summary, no further action required. Body. Let this conclude what never should have needed proving. I closed the exit strategy folder for the last time and moved it to archive. I powered off my phone again, not because I was tired of them calling, but because I didn't need to hear their panic anymore. I had peace now. The truth didn't need me to scream. It just needed me to stop hiding, and now they couldn't look away. I didn't return their calls, but the audit returned their silence with questions they couldn't bury. The report arrived by courier, not email. Thick, spiral-bound, and sealed in a nondescript white envelope, no logos, no labels. Just my name typed in clean black font. Inside, the findings were everything I had suspected, and worse. Unauthorized use of silent shareholder signatures, disbursements with no vendor trail, asset movement that didn't match board minutes. No criminal charges were filed. Of course not. That would have meant dragging the family name through public mud, something investors hated more than the truth. But Valora was asked to step aside from all public-facing roles. Quilon announced a temporary sabbatical to recalibrate priorities. The firm's internal ethics council had issued recommendations for restructuring. Publicly, they called it refining the culture. Internally, they called it damage control. I called it what it was: accountability. I didn't send out a statement. I didn't take interviews. I didn't post a victory-laced paragraph on LinkedIn. I read the report, closed it, filed it in a drawer marked final. That same afternoon, I received an email from Marjorie. No subject line, No formal greeting. Just one sentence. Can we meet no lawyers? I didn't respond. I printed it, slipped it into a new folder labeled Aftermath, and returned to my cup of tea. There was no pleasure in ignoring her, but no pain either, just the understanding that we had arrived at different destinations, and hers had a door I wasn't interested in walking back through. Clyde never called, not during the audit, not after, not when I was erased from the company website, not when the press speculated about internal disputes at Vanden. I wondered for a moment whether his silence was a form of pride or guilt, whether he had chosen not to speak because he didn't know what to say, or because he knew exactly what he'd done. I didn't chase the answer. That, too, was part of the healing. A week later, a package arrived on my doorstep. No return address. Just my name and handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. Inside, carefully wrapped, was the photo frame that used to sit in the Vanden lobby. The one with all 5 of us, Clyde, Marjorie, Valora, Quillan, and me standing in front of the original warehouse. The glass was cracked, a clean fracture running diagonally through my face. I didn't hang it. I didn't fix it. I slid it into a drawer. No drama, no fury, just one more thing that didn't need a spotlight to hold meaning. I wasn't part of that photo anymore. Not really, but I still existed outside its frame. The following Saturday, I walked through downtown Spokane with a coffee in hand, not on my way to a boardroom, but to meet Claire, a friend I hadn't made time for in years. We were having brunch, eggs Benedict and gossip, not spreadsheets and silence. I didn't bring my laptop. I didn't check my phone. And I didn't mention the company. She didn't ask. That was the gift. As we talked, I realized I didn't need Vanden's recognition to feel anchored. They had erased me from the company, but I had reclaimed my name in a place they couldn't touch myself. That night, I logged out of my encrypted archive for the last time. Not because I was finished preparing, but because I was no longer preparing to fight. Sometimes resolution isn't found in a courtroom. It's found in an empty inbox, a voicemail you never play again, a photo you choose not to display, and a voice, your own, that no longer needs permission to speak.